Chapter 567. Of course there were guards around the curtain. Although this place was not conspicuous and the secret was well kept, not many outsiders knew about it. However, the thing below was too important, so many people were sent to watch over it. The guards stationed here were, of course, people from Jianghu. Most of them were from Fiyunji, and a small number were from Starry Hall. The reason for this arrangement was, of course, that the leadership of the mysterious underground cave city had fallen into the hands of the two Jianghu forces. As the most popular animals in Tianlong Mountain and Jianghu in recent days, oxen and black dog were already quite famous. The guards standing here also had to change shifts to go up the mountain. After a while, of course, they were very clear about the origin of this cow and dog. At this time, everyone was a little dumbfounded. Not to mention in the Immortal City, even on Tianlong Mountain where the headquarters of Jianghu was located, these two spirit beasts almost strolled everywhere, and no one was nosy enough to stop them. Of course, unless it was some serious places such as the cave residences of several deity transformation stage perfected cultivators, or the important places of several mountain halls, this kind of place was not allowed. However, it was hard to say for Atsu, but oxen seemed to be a giant beast that had become a spirit. It never went near places that were taboo and places that might have powerful figures such as deity transformation stage perfected cultivators. Because of this, they didn't go to important places, and people would certainly give face to perfected Lord Tianlan and Fiyunji, so they wouldn't stop them. But this time it seemed to be a little different. Regardless of whether it was the guards of the Floating Clouds Division or the Starry Hall, as long as they were guarding this place, they had been warned sternly by their superiors before they came that the underground tunnel was an extremely important place, and they had to guard it with all their might. They could not be careless. And they had indeed achieved this. Although there were many problems in Jianghu today such as overstaffing, extravagance and exaggeration, and evading responsibility, it was still a hegemon of a generation. It had a solid foundation and it was still possible for its subordinates to take things seriously. However, the situation they were in right now was a little troublesome. Seeing that oxen and the black dog seemed to be very determined to walk into the curtain, the group of guards looked at each other. The people of Fiyunji looked at the guards of Starry Hall, and the people of Starry Hall looked at the experts of Fiyunji with hope. Then everyone realized that there was nothing they could do. In the end, someone from the Starry Hall shouted, "Hey! Can you guys from Fiyunji block them?" There were many people on Fiyunji's side. Soon someone replied, "Why? Why aren't you guys attacking?" The guard of the Starry Hall actually laughed. He seemed to be taking pleasure in their misfortune. He said, "These two bastards came from your Floating Clouds office, right?" The guards of Fiyunji were instantly speechless. Oxen was perfected Lord Tianlan's spiritual beast, and the black dog was the pet of perfected Lord Tianlan's only disciple, Lu Qin. Needless to say, the master and disciple status was high, but they both liked to keep pets. This was something that could not be refuted. Helpless, when they saw the people from the Starry Hall retreating, the guards from the Floating Clouds Agency had no choice but to walk over. About 10 of them lined up in a row and formed a human wall, blocking the green bull and Atu's path. The green ox looked up and stopped in his tracks. Atu poked his head out from behind it to take a look and was instantly a little angry. This fellow had recently been used to being arrogant with the green ox, and this was the first time he saw someone daring to block his way. He jumped out, bared his snow-white fangs and roared at the person in front of him, baring his teeth in a fierce manner. Brr. His meaning could not be more obvious. "You blind people, get out of our way. Don't block our Lord Ox and Lord Dog from taking a stroll." The guards of the Floating Clouds Agency all had bitter expressions on their faces. One of them lowered his voice and whispered, "I say, this is Lord True Immortal's spiritual beast. Isn't it extremely powerful? If it gets angry, won't we be in trouble?" When the people next to them heard this, their expressions became even worse. This situation could be said to be the worst. It was even worse than when perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, Lu Qin, brought people over to stop them. Although Lu Qin's status was extremely high, he was still a human, and humans had to be reasonable, right? As long as they clearly explained the rules here and everyone followed the rules, even Lu Qin could not do anything to them. But it was very annoying to deal with this ox and dog. If the spiritual beast in front of them got angry and rushed over to kill people, how would that end up? That was perfected Lord Tianlan's most beloved pet. Would anyone dare to reason with perfected Lord Tianlan? And even if perfected Lord Tianlan was reasonable, he would at most comfort them with kind words and give them some compensation. He would not really kill oxen to pay for it. If that happened, the dead would not be resurrected and they would have died in vain. They were all people in Jianghu. Who didn't know this? Even small fries had their own intelligence and wit. Thus, no one dared to go up and criticize her sternly. This was a forbidden area, and she didn't allow them to wander around. However, it wasn't good for them to give way. Otherwise, if they were to be held accountable, Hallmaster Shui Ying would definitely have to bear the consequences. After a while, Oxen became a little impatient. Black Dog saw that no one was paying attention to it, and immediately became angry. Did dogs not care about their reputation? Especially when there was an enigmatic boss, Oxen, behind it. Atsu bared its fangs and roared. It began to press forward with a very fierce momentum. It seemed like it was about to eat someone. The guards in Fuyunji were in an uproar. This black dog did not look like much on normal days, but when it suddenly became fierce, its momentum was very fierce and frightening. It was as if it was going to pounce on them and bite their throats in the next moment. There were a few sounds of pa 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 pa. 3 or 4 people pulled out their weapons at the same time. The atmosphere suddenly became tense. Even the people from the Starry Hall who were watching from the sidelines stopped smiling and had solemn expressions on their faces. The guard duty here was very important. If something really happened, even if they were not the main responsibility, they would most likely be scolded or even punished. Atsu was not afraid of those weapons. It still slowly moved forward step by step. It was half testing and half pressuring. At the same time, a strange black flame flashed in the depths of its eyes. Just when the atmosphere suddenly became so tense that it made people hold their breath, they heard a low moo. Oxen appeared next to Atsu and blocked its way. Atsu glanced at Oxen and put away its fangs. The threatening momentum disappeared, and the guards in front of them immediately breathed a sigh of relief. Unexpectedly, Oxen raised its head and walked forward without saying a word. The guards only saw a blur in front of them, and the huge body of the bull was in front of them in an instant. The guards were shocked and were about to shout for it to stop when they suddenly saw the green ox shake its head. With a scream, the guard who was closest to the ox's head suddenly rose into the air, and then flew into the distance with a strange cry. With a bang, he smashed into a piece of cloth, and then tore off 3 or 4 pieces of cloth at the side. Immediately the ground was a mess. Dang dang. The group of guards suddenly stood up with a dignified look on their faces. They unsheathed their weapons and surrounded the cow and dog. Chapter 568. Everyone present was shocked. When the figure flew into the sky, everyone's gaze followed it, then turned their heads at the same time. They watched as the flying figure drew an arc in midair, then fell to the side of the curtain with a loud noise. A pile of things were torn off, revealing half of the tunnel entrance that was originally covered. Atsu poked its head out from behind Oxen's huge body and blinked its doggy eyes. It looked at this silent big guy with a look of admiration. It seemed like it really had a lot to learn. I seem to have heard Lu Qin say something like, "A dog that bites doesn't bark?" However, Atsu immediately felt that something wasn't quite right. Lu Qin's words seemed to be cursing someone. For a moment, the dog's mind wandered, and it began to recall the situation when Lu Qin said those words to it. Was it a sarcastic curse? After all, this person was too bad. He was full of bad ideas and would often be tricked. It was better to be careful. Not to mention the fact that Atsu actually dared to be distracted at this critical moment. The guards in front were in an uproar. They immediately pulled out their weapons and surrounded the 2 spirit beasts. However, they could only surround the 2 spiritual beasts. Although the weapons were extremely sharp and flashed with a cold light, none of the menacing guards dared to make a move against the 2 spiritual beasts. Beasts were stronger than humans. Was this the situation? Oxen seemed to turn a blind eye to the people in front of it. At this moment, its big bell-like eyes were looking at the secret underground entrance that was half exposed, and a strange light seemed to flash across its eyes. Then, without any hesitation, it lifted its foot and walked toward the entrance of the tunnel. Oxen's body was originally extremely huge. Although it had been silent, its aura was very intimidating. As it walked forward, the 5 or 6 human guards in front of it suddenly felt as if a small mountain was pressing down on them. Even their breathing became a little nervous. But at this critical moment, Oxen suddenly stopped and turned back to take a look. The pressure was instantly relieved, and the few of them let out a long sigh of relief. Just when they thought that the situation had taken a turn for the better, they noticed that Oxen had turned around to glare at the black dog, who was standing there in a daze for some reason. With a swing of its tail, it smacked the black dog's head. Atsu was startled and woke up. He turned his head to look around and immediately felt a little embarrassed. He barked twice and trotted over. At the same time, he felt a little strange. In the past, he would never be in a daze at a time like this. What was going on today? Could it be that this oxen is too powerful and I feel very safe so I don't have any scruples? He had never felt this way before, even when he was with Lu Qin. Atsu glanced at Oxen and thought to himself, I'll have to hold on to this big bull leg in the future. Oxen woke up Atsu. Although it was a little dissatisfied, it didn't seem to be very angry. It turned back and walked forward again. The few guards' faces suddenly became bitter again. However, things had already come to this point and they couldn't back down anymore. They looked at each other with a dignified expression, but each of them had already mobilized their spiritual power. Their weapons and magic weapons gradually lit up. This meant that they were going to fight to the death. Seeing these few Fuyunji people acting like this, the people next to them also suddenly became gloomy. No one shouted. All the Fuyunji people quickly moved, and a murderous aura rose around them. This time around there was no longer any panic or apprehension. Instead it was filled with a bloody aura. This was the characteristic of Fuyunji for many years, and it was cultivated from the sea of blood. In a place further away the people from Starry Hall were originally gloating, but at this time they suddenly felt this aura, and they instantly quieted down. One of the people in the lead hesitated for a moment, but he lowered his head and said something to the people next to him. Then he turned around and rushed in the direction of Mount Tianlong in the distance. Oxen and the black dog were both spiritual beasts with keen senses, so of course, it was impossible for them not to feel this aura. Atsu was the first to stop. If dogs could frown, this black dog would be frowning right now. It was willing to wander around with Oxen, but after all, it had already gained spirituality and knew Lu Chen's position in Zhangxianmeng. To put it bluntly, these people were very likely to be Lu Chen's subordinates in the future. It didn't matter if they bullied them occasionally, but it was completely different to fight or even kill them. Atsu instantly wanted to retreat and it barked at Oxen. However, Oxen, who was usually very lazy, was unusually persistent today for some reason. It seemed that it was determined to go to the secret passage. It turned a deaf ear to Atsu's barking. After pausing for a moment, it continued to move forward. Atsu was dumbfounded, but it couldn't just stand there, so it had to reluctantly follow. The people on the other side were waiting. As the two sides gradually approached each other, the street was silent. The situation was still tense and a battle was about to break out. At this unusually tense moment, someone suddenly coughed behind the street and then someone scolded, "Stupid dog, what are you doing over there? Hurry up and come over." Oxen stopped and Atsu instantly turned around. Then it saw Lu Chen and Old Ma walking over from the street. Their faces were very serious and they seemed a little angry. Atsu let out a loud bark, and then it ran towards Lu Chen, wagging its tail vigorously along the way. No one knew why it was so happy. Lu Chen snorted, and then he patted the head of the dog that had rushed in front of him, and said in a low voice, "Stupid dog, you only know how to make trouble for me." Atsu seemed to not understand what he said, and it only grinned and wagged its tail. Lu Chen coughed and then he walked towards Oxen. Oxen stared at him and its eyes were deep, and it seemed to be a little gloomy. As for the surrounding guards who were nervously holding weapons in their hands, they still looked very stern, and none of them had any intention of putting down the magic weapons in their hands. Lu Chen walked to Oxen's side and said in a low voice, "I say, the people here are all the damn Baldy's subordinates, don't do anything stupid." Oxen let out a low moo, but it didn't say anything. Lu Chen looked ahead again and he frowned and said, "You want to go down?" This time, Oxen nodded. Lu Chen hesitated for a moment, then he waved his hand to call the guard in front of him, and said with a serious expression, "Do I have the right to go down?" The guard nodded. Lu Chen was perfected Lord Tianlan's disciple, and he was the one who discovered and destroyed the devil cult's lair, so he was definitely one of the few who had the right to go down. Lu Chen said, "Okay, then I'll go down now and I'll bring these two to have a look." As he said that, he smiled and said, "You don't think that they'll leak the secret, do you?" It was hard to say since they were spirit beasts, but one of them was perfected Lord Tianlan, and the other was Lu Chen's, so the possibility of them leaking the secret was not high. Moreover, Lu Chen had said it himself, so it could be considered as giving everyone a way out. Therefore everyone made way and Lu Chen brought Oxen and the black dog down. Behind them, Old Ma also walked forward, but he was stopped by the guards who said, "You can't go in." Old Ma was annoyed and he pointed at the figures in front of him and said angrily, "I'm not as good as those two beasts?" The guard nodded. "Yes." After saying that, he seemed to feel that his words were a little harsh, so he comforted Old Ma, "Don't be sad, we're the same." After that, everyone felt that it was a little strange and everyone was a little embarrassed. However, in the midst of the chaos, a petite figure quietly followed behind Lu Chen and the others, and snuck into the secret passage. Chapter 569. It had been a while since Lu Chen last came to the underground city in the mysterious cave. When he walked through the passageway and saw the majestic underground city again, his heart was still the same as when he first saw this place. A feeling of admiration welled up in his heart along with a slightly strange feeling. The blood-red moon was still floating in the sky, emitting a seemingly endless blood-red light. It seemed that it would never stop, nor would it stop. It was like this blood-red moon had existed in this place ever since Pangu created the world, and had never changed. When the red light shone on him, Lu Chen's body and footsteps paused. At that moment he felt an unpleasant aura that suppressed his spiritual power. However, he was not afraid of it, nor did he panic. Firstly, he could endure this feeling. Secondly, he had secretly proven that although the aura of this blood moon was strange, it only suppressed most ordinary cultivators. On the other hand, the mysterious black fire in his body was not affected by this place once it was activated. Back then, black fire had helped him a lot when he was able to break through the siege of the devil cult followers. Of course, with his many years of experience, black fire had already saved him many times. Thinking of this, Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. He looked to his side and saw Oxen and Black Dog walking over. Among them, Atsu's body seemed to have paused for a moment, but soon returned to normal. On the contrary, Oxen, who had always been unfathomable, suddenly trembled and its movements became a little slower after being bathed in the light of the blood moon. At the next moment, Oxen seemed to have turned its huge horns with some difficulty and let out a low moo. Then it suddenly staggered and almost fell to the ground. This time both Lu Chen and Atsu were taken aback. No one expected that Oxen would have such a big reaction when they walked into this underground blood moon city. It was even a little scary. Lu Chen quickly turned around and supported Oxen's body. Atsu also rushed over in a hurry. It barked repeatedly and used its body to push against Oxen's stomach, trying to make it stand steadily. However, Oxen's body was a little too huge. Lu Chen and Atsu struggled to support it in a hurry. Fortunately, although Oxen still looked a little uncomfortable, it managed to stand firmly on its own after shaking for a while. Then it slowly bent its legs and sat on the ground. Lu Chen was also stunned and puzzled. One must know that although the blood moon here had a strange power that could suppress many human cultivators, even if ordinary cultivators came in and felt uncomfortable, they wouldn't have such an obvious and serious reaction like Oxen. Otherwise, they wouldn't have arranged for people from the Starry Hall to come here to do those secret things. The green ox knelt on the ground with its head drooped. After a while it seemed to be in better spirits, but overall, it still gave off a rare feeling of illness. Lu Chen frowned and glanced at the blood moon in the sky. Then he whispered to Oxen, "What's going on? If it really can't stand the blood moon, let's go out first?" Oxen raised its pair of huge eyes and looked over Lu Chen's body at the houses below that were taller than ordinary human houses. It looked into the distance in silence. Its gaze swept across the street and finally fell on the center of the city, on the strange statue that connected the ground and the cave dome. "Moo!" Oxen called out in a low voice. Lu Chen followed its gaze and looked in that direction. Then, he hesitated for a moment and asked tentatively, "Do you want to go there?" Oxen nodded, but the black dog next to it seemed to be a little anxious and barked. Lu Chen was also a little worried. Looking at Oxen's dispirited appearance, he smiled bitterly and said, "There are two problems. First, you're too big and heavy. I can't move or push you. Second, we're only at the edge of the blood moon. Are you sure you won't die if we go further in?" Oxen hesitated for a moment, but it still looked at the statue in the distance with determination. Clearly it still insisted on its idea. Atsu looked at it worriedly. However, Lu Chen wasn't Atsu, so he didn't have that kind of reverence for it. Therefore Lu Chen quickly said without holding back, "Don't waste your time. I don't care if you want to die, but you're a treasure in the eyes of that damn Baldy. At the very least, I don't know what else he values more than you. If I really kill you here, that damn Baldy will fight me to the death." Oxen glared at Lu Chen with a hint of annoyance and anger in its eyes. Then it put on a disdainful expression. Lu Chen slapped the top of the bull's head and scolded, "What are you pretending for? When I was still by that damn Baldy's side, you used that stupid look to trick me. Do you think I'll fall for it again?" A hint of helplessness appeared on Oxen's face as it fell silent. "Let's go." Lu Chen grabbed Oxen's head and pulled it back to where they came from. He said, "If you have the guts, you can ask that damn Baldy to send you down here himself. If anything happens to you, he'll be responsible for it. It has nothing to do with me. I don't care if you die or not." Atu was a little dumbfounded as he watched from the side. He did not expect Lu Qin to be so familiar with the green bull and treat it like an outsider. As for the green bull, it did not react much to Lu Qin's actions, perhaps because it was affected by the blood moon's brilliance or some other reason. Oxen even sighed softly. Yes, this cow sighed softly. There was a hint of helplessness in its voice, which was almost the same as a human's. Lu Qin didn't care about it as if he was already used to it. Behind them, Atsu was a little puzzled. At the other corner of the cave, behind a hidden rock, a petite figure slowly poked her head out. She revealed a pair of bright eyes as she watched the scene. There was a hint of astonishment in her eyes. In the end, Oxen didn't insist or struggle too much. It just left with Lu Qin even though it was unusually determined to come down to the underground city at the cost of fighting the guards. Therefore it seemed that it had a strong start but a weak finish. However, from this, it could be seen that even though it was not as obvious as perfected Lord Tianlan's reaction, the green ox clearly viewed Lu Qin in a different light. Lu Qin brought the green bull and the black dog Atu down for a walk, then turned around and left without doing anything. It could be said that he was all bark and no bite. However, after they left, another figure suddenly walked out of the empty underground cave. It was an extremely beautiful young lady. It was White Lotus. Bai Lian first glanced at the passageway that they had come in from, and then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. She then looked at the blood moon in the sky and after a while she seemed to have made a decision. She strode forward and walked towards the strange statue in the center of the city, as if she wanted to investigate it herself. As she walked, her footsteps and movements seemed to be a little unnatural compared to usual. She should have been somewhat affected by the suppression of the blood moon, but it was still much better than the green ox. The suppression was not as great. As she stepped on the long street, a series of crisp footsteps echoed in the city. When the sound wave drifted, it spread to a deep dry well in a courtyard in a corner. A shadow in the darkness moved slightly. It raised its head and glanced at the world above. After a while it seemed to move very slowly and then slowly stood up. Chapter 570. The huge underground cave was now silent. There were no signs of people or animals, including some common underground creatures such as bats and mice. White Lotus didn't see any of them. There was only the almost omnipresent blood-red light that shone down from the blood-red moon in the sky, filling every corner of this place. After White Lotus walked on the long street for a while, she couldn't help but look around. Those tall houses and pavilions were obviously not suitable for humans to live in. Although the old houses were there, the owners were gone. Those empty tall doors and big houses were stained with the color of blood, giving off a strange and eerie feeling, as if in the next moment, some kind of monster would rush out from some dark red corner and pounce on White Lotus. This feeling was very bad and frightening. White Lotus's delicate brows furrowed. She looked a little hesitant as if she wanted to retreat and leave this place. However, her eyes then looked towards the depths of this underground city. After hesitating for a while, she finally continued to walk towards the tall but strange statue. Since she was already here, she had to take a clear look. This place was tightly guarded by the men of the Floating Clouds Agency and the Starry Hall. There had to be some kind of huge secret hidden underground. White Lotus walked step by step and approached the statue. Along the way she walked very carefully. At the same time she secretly felt strange. Logically speaking, the underground territory was so huge. With Zheng Xianming's strength and deep foundation in the Immortal City for so many years, it was really impossible for him not to discover the strangeness of this underground. Then why was this underground city only exposed recently? Could it be that it was really the ancestors of Zheng Xianming who sealed this place? Just when White Lotus was puzzled, when she walked past the door of a big house on the long street, she suddenly heard a sound. Pa! The sound was very soft and not very loud. However, because the surroundings were too quiet, it became especially clear and White Lotus heard it immediately. White Lotus immediately stopped in her tracks. Her expression changed slightly and she turned towards the house. The big house looked no different from the other houses that they had passed before. Looking from the door, it was also empty and there was nothing suspicious about it. However, White Lotus didn't think that what she just heard was just an illusion. She heard it very clearly. She stood in the same place and stared at the depths of the house. For a moment she was a little hesitant. Should she go in or leave this place? This underground city was so strange. Obviously, it was very likely that there was something strange and terrifying hidden here. However, White Lotus immediately remembered that Lu Qin had brought Oxen and Black Dog here. Judging from their actions and expressions, they didn't seem to feel any signs of danger here. Even if Lu Qin could act, Oxen and Black Dog definitely couldn't. White Lotus lifted her foot and wanted to walk towards the house, but she immediately put it down. After hesitating for a few times, she couldn't make a decision in the end. It could be said that her heart was in a dilemma. However, at this moment, White Lotus glanced at the ground in front of her and was suddenly shocked. At this moment, other than the red light shining on her body and drawing out a shadow on the ground, there was actually another shadow behind her. It was taller and longer than her, and just like that, it appeared behind her without a sound. White Lotus's body instantly turned as cold as water. She even held her breath. Lu Qin brought Oxen and Black Dog back to the surface. Seeing that they came out of the tunnel so quickly, the guards who were originally discussing among themselves were a little surprised. At the same time, many of them had a look of relief on their faces. In any case, in this short period of time, the most they could do was to go down and take a look at the scenery below. After that, they would have to hurry back. In such a short period of time, they probably wouldn't be able to do anything bad even if they wanted to. Everyone had a heavy responsibility on their shoulders, so it was better to avoid trouble. Immediately, someone came over to greet Lu Qin politely. Lu Qin responded with a few perfunctory words and then turned to look at Oxen. After leaving the light of the blood moon underground, Oxen's mental state was obviously a lot better. However, its head was still drooping and it seemed to be a little dispirited. Lu Qin thought for a while, then left the tunnel entrance with Oxen and Atsu. On the way, he greeted Old Ma, who was standing on the side. Old Ma rushed over and said with a surprised expression, "What happened? You came out so quickly?" "I'll tell you in detail later." Lu Qin also said perfunctory words to Old Ma. Then he gestured to Old Ma to help him. Together, they supported the sickly Oxen and walked toward Mount Tianlong. As for the direction, it was naturally the Kunlun Palace of Supreme Lord Tianlan. Therefore, about an hour later, although his spirit had recovered slightly, the Green Bull, who had spent a lot of time on the way, finally returned to the Kunlun Hall under Lu Chen's strong request. Fortunately, Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't go out today. He stayed in the palace. When the footsteps of Lu Qin and Old Ma came from the gate, as well as the slightly messy steps of the two spirit beasts, Supreme Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne, glanced at the gate. After a while, his attention seemed to be completely focused on Oxen. Old Ma, who was following Lu Qin, was about to bow to Supreme Lord Tianlan, who was sitting on the lotus throne in the distance. However, at that moment he felt dizzy, and then a tall and sturdy figure suddenly appeared in front of him. In that short moment, Supreme Lord Tianlan had passed through the long palace and directly came to the side of Oxen. Oxen raised its head, looked at Supreme Lord Tianlan and called out in a low voice. Supreme Lord Tianlan's expression changed slightly. It seemed that his expression was a little ugly. He walked forward with a sullen face. He first looked at Oxen's complexion. Then he suddenly put his hand on Oxen's head, touched its ears and opened its eyelids to have a look. Then he put his hand on the side of Oxen's chest and carefully felt it. His expression became even more ugly. Where did it go? Supreme Lord Tianlan turned to Lu Qin and asked. Oxen took a look at Lu Qin, and there seemed to be some hidden meaning in its eyes. However, Lu Qin did not keep it a secret at all. In the blink of an eye, he told everything clearly from the beginning to the end, including the matter of Oxen and Atsu strolling on the street at the beginning. After hearing that Oxen actually ran to the underground city, Supreme Lord Tianlan first snorted. Then, when he heard Lu Qin say that it immediately collapsed after entering the underground city, he couldn't help but shake his head. He wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Then he waved to the side and said, "Old Ma, you can leave now." Old Ma hesitated for a moment, but he still obeyed and left the hall. The moment he stepped out of the door, he vaguely heard Supreme Lord Tianlan instructing Lu Qin, "You also go down. Do you feel uncomfortable?" Lu Qin slightly lowered his eyes and said, "Well, I feel that after staying there for a long time, my whole body has begun to feel strange. I can't use my strength and even the circulation of spiritual chi has slowed down. If I really have to fight fiercely in the underground city, I think I can only use 4 or 5 of my full strength at most." Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and looked at Lu Qin for a moment. Then he sat beside Oxen, pressed its head with one hand and pressed its chest with the other. After a while, a warm breath of pure yang was slowly emitted from his body. With the appearance of this yang qi, Oxen's face was obviously much better. Lu Qin, on the other hand, stood aside and looked at perfected Lord Tianlan's broad and strong back from the side. Suddenly, a daring idea occurred to him. They are all divine transformation realm perfected cultivators, and they are so powerful that they can shake the world. But will they also be like Elder Yun Shouyang of the Devil Cult, who had his heart meridian cut off and could no longer fight back? What was the name of that mysterious magic incantation formation? Well, by the way, it seemed to be called God Subduing Spell? Chapter 571. At that moment, Lu Qin was a little absent-minded. Just now, he suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he recalled what happened in the Barren Valley. Once upon a time, he always felt that that memory was accompanied by unforgettable pain, which was deeply buried in his heart and would haunt him for the rest of his life. He would never be able to find peace and forget it. After all, every time he suffered the pain of being burned by the black flames, he would recall the people and events of the past, as well as the blood on his hands, as well as the things he had seen in those dark times that he did not want to recall. However, now that it had come to this, he realized to his shock that he had underestimated time in the end. No matter how deep the pain was, it would be relieved with the passage of time. If people were not repeatedly reminded of it, perhaps those memories would be quietly erased from the depths of their consciousness. Who would deliberately recall those painful memories, unless it was the kind of unforgettable hatred that had been engraved in their hearts? Young children used to naively think that they would remember every beautiful moment and tell themselves that this moment was so important that they would never forget it. Then, when they grew up and looked back on the past, they found that everything had been covered by the dust of the past, and they could no longer recall the memories of those years. However, they still remembered the solemn and beautiful feelings of the children. "What's wrong with you?" Suddenly, the voice of Supreme Lord Tianlan came from the front, awakening Lu Qin from that somewhat bewildered state. He turned around and saw that Oxen, who had been lying on the ground sickly, had now stood up and seemed to be in much better spirits. He didn't know what method Supreme Lord Tianlan had used just now, but it was like a miraculous cure that had instantly freed Oxen from the state of being suppressed by the aura of the blood moon. After looking around, Oxen walked to its favorite seat at the side of the hall and lay down. Atsu followed it and wagged its tail gently, looking up and down curiously at Oxen's body, as if it was very surprised by this magical change. "I'm fine." Lu Qin naturally changed the topic. Looking at Oxen, he asked Supreme Lord Tianlan, "What's wrong with this bull?" Although the underground blood moon was strange, it shouldn't be to this extent. These days, quite a number of human cultivators from Fuyunji and Starry Hall have gone down there. Some of them have high attainments, but I have never heard of anyone having such a big reaction like this one. Perfected Lord Tianlan took another look at him and said indifferently, "I'm not sure either. Perhaps the blood moon suppression on Oxen is particularly strong." Lu Qin mumbled, "It's strange this time as well. I remember that whenever this cow was in danger, it would always sense it beforehand and avoid it. It's never been in such a sorry state like this." Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and hesitated. When Lu Qin saw his indifferent expression, he bid farewell and walked out. Watching his disciple leave, Perfected Lord Tianlan's expressionless face gradually changed. He turned to look at Oxen, who was lying on the other side of the hall. He then slowly walked over and sat down beside Oxen. His expression gradually became a little strange, abnormally complicated, and mixed with some inexplicable emotions. In the quiet hall, after a long time, there seemed to be a sigh. Then someone said faintly, "Are you already old?" In the mysterious underground city shrouded by the light of the blood moon, White Lotus felt cold all over, as if she had fallen into an ice cellar. She stared at the shadow reflected on the ground in front of her. Other than her own shadow, there was another shadow that was even bigger. This was an underground world that was so quiet that it could even be said to be dead. Under the blood-red light, there seemed to be no living creatures here. As long as the human cultivators in Zhengxianmeng did not come here, there would be no human figures, no animals, and not even a common plant. Under the blood-red light, even the omnipresent sounds of insects could not be found. Therefore, it was hard not to associate the figure that suddenly appeared in this place with something like a demon or a ghost. For White Lotus, that short moment felt like a particularly long and torturous time. Her hands seemed to stretch forward in a panic, but she did not look back. Suddenly, she let out a low shout, and her petite body suddenly flew forward. At the same time, she waved her hands backward with force. Then the surrounding temperature suddenly dropped, and 2 icy snowstorms swept over and hit her back. The mysterious figure seemed to be surprised. Snow Wind Scripture? The Snow Wind Scripture was actually not very famous. In the world of cultivation, more than half of the people had never heard of this thing. However, in the hearts of those who knew about this thing, this Snow Wind Scripture was undoubtedly the most powerful thing in the world. The snow wind scripture was undoubtedly related to Hakushin Jinkuin of the Kunlun party. In fact, before Hakushin Jinkuin, this snow wind scripture had never appeared, so some people thought that perhaps Hakushin Jinkuin had created this snow wind scripture. However, there were also people who privately thought that although Hakushin Jinkuin was very powerful, his and Lord Tianlan's master, Master Tianhong, was the truly amazing heaven's favored one, and most likely inherited it from their master. However, this mysterious and unfathomable Tao, art, and divine power seemed to have always had a bumpy fate. When perfected Lord Baichen was still alive, he did not teach his two eldest disciples who had such great aptitudes. In the end, he only taught it to his last disciple, the young girl White Lotus, who was only about 10 years old. Now that he had passed away, White Lotus might be the last person in the world who knew such a powerful and strange snow wind scripture. However, even though the snow wind scripture was powerful, if one's cultivation was not enough, it would still be a tree without roots, a duckweed without roots. After the initial shock, the black figure swayed a few times. Although it seemed slow, it was actually very fast. In an instant, it flashed past the two snowstorms that looked like they could freeze a person's flesh and blood, and caught up with White Lotus. White Lotus felt a sharp aura locked onto her back like a blade. That feeling of uneasiness and danger grew stronger. In a moment of desperation, she was about to make another killing move when suddenly her vision blurred. That black figure appeared in front of her like a ghost. White Lotus was shocked, her body could not stop and crashed forward. But at this moment, her eyes suddenly flashed past a ferocious mask with a green face and long fangs. The person who appeared in front of her was wearing this mask. White Lotus's heart suddenly tightened. At that moment, she suddenly thought of a person, that person. Although she had never seen him, but she had heard of him countless times in Zhengxianming. Elder Ghost of the Evil Faction. Chapter 572. Lu Qin left the Kunlun Hall with Atsu. When he came out, he saw Old Ma standing alone outside the door. He walked over to Old Ma and greeted him from afar. Old Ma smiled and nodded as he walked over. "I thought you went back first," Lu Qin said to Old Ma with a smile. Old Ma smiled and shook his head. He glanced in the direction of the Kunlun Hall and then looked at Lu Qin with a questioning look. Lu Qin shook his head, indicating that there was nothing inside. Old Ma grunted in acknowledgement. Then he said to Lu Qin, "Oh, by the way, Hallmaster Xue from the Floating Clouds Division sent someone to look for you. He wants to invite you over to discuss something." Lu Qin was startled and said, "What did they say?" Old Ma said, "That's nothing, but I saw that the messenger who came just now looked normal. He didn't look anxious or anxious. I don't think it's anything urgent." Lu Qin nodded. Thinking that there was nothing urgent at the moment, he walked towards the Fiyunji Hall. Not long after, they arrived outside the Fiyunji Hall. After all, this place was not too far from the Kunlun Hall. Someone had already announced their arrival. Not long after, they politely invited Lu Qin and Old Ma in with Shui Ying's orders. As for the black dog, it didn't follow them in. Recently, the dog didn't seem to like this kind of grand and spacious hall very much. It didn't want to go in easily, so it ran away on its own. Lu Qin and Old Ma didn't care about this. The black dog was getting smarter and had a backer. No one on Mount Celestial Dragon would deliberately make things difficult for it, so it ran around freely. After a while, the two of them were brought to the living room of the Fiyunji Hall. Shuang sat there and waited. But what surprised Lu Qin and Old Ma was that there was another person in the room. It was Qin He, who had been betrayed by Lu Qin from the devil cult. Logically speaking, there were many reasons why Qin He would betray the evil sect and attack his old master, but Lu Qin's role was undoubtedly at the top of the list. Without Lu Qin, Qin He might have died in Fiyunji's prison, and not become an honored guest of Fiyunji after betraying the devil cult. It was precisely because of this that Qin He spent most of his time by Lu Qin's side when he first defected, showing his loyalty to Lu Qin. In the eyes of outsiders, he was the new generation of Lu Qin's henchmen. However, for some unknown reason, after the Fuyun Company had schemed for a long time and finally dealt a heavy blow to the evil cult, almost completely uprooting this malignant tumor from the huge immortal city, Lu Qin, intentionally or unintentionally, began to distance himself from Qin He. Usually, they were just acquaintances who nodded at each other and did not really have the intention to accept him as a confidant. This was out of many people's expectations, including the leader of Fiyunji, Shuang, and Qin He himself. They all thought that Lu Qin would naturally expand his power. Shuang was very vigilant about this, and Qin He was very excited. He couldn't wait to become Lu Qin's core team. When Lu Qin truly inherited the foundation of Lord Tianlan, he would be able to soar to the sky. So, During that period of time, Qin He did everything possible to express goodwill to Lu Qin, and worked hard to leave a good impression on his future boss. Of course, the final result was not bad, but he did not catch Elder Ghost, so it was not perfect. Maybe it was because of this that Lu Qin hated him? Qin He could not help but think so. He was a defector, and in terms of experience and strength, he could not compare to the people on Fiyunji's side. In order to survive, there were almost no surprises in the choice he had to make next. He quickly approached Xueying, and after Xueying slightly relented and showed some intentions, he officially defected to her side. Seeing Lu Qin and old Ma walk in, Xueying and Qin He also stood up, a smile on their faces. Xueying's smile was calm and light, elegant and polite, while Qin He's smile was a little more enthusiastic, and he even took the initiative to greet Lu Qin and old Ma. Lu Qin also smiled, seemingly not minding Qin He's action of approaching Xueying. After exchanging a few words of modesty with him, Lu Qin smiled and sat down on his seat. He then smiled at Xueying and said, "Hallmaster Xue, why have you called me here today?" Xueying nodded, not intending to beat around the bush, and said, "I heard that you plan to tell the true Lord that there is a lack of manpower in the Western continent to hunt down the remnants of the devil cult, so you want to send old Ma there?" Lu Qin's eyes flashed, but his expression did not change. Instead, it was old Ma who was sitting beside him who was faintly surprised, not quite understanding why Xueying suddenly brought this up. At this moment, Lu Qin said, "Yes, I have already mentioned this to Master and wanted to send old Ma over. But Master said that the Immortal City also needs a lot of manpower, and it is not appropriate to send too many people out, so he declined." Xueying nodded, looked at Lu Qin and said with a smile, "It's like this, I invited junior brother Lu here today because there is something I want to tell you. The matter of hunting down the evildoers of the devil cult in the Western continent is indeed very important, and it is true that there is a lack of manpower there. So after thinking about it, I have decided to send Qin He over. He has been to the Western continent before, and has had a lot of contact with the local devil cult demons, so he is the best candidate for this task." Lu Qin and old Ma's expressions changed slightly, and then they looked at Qin He together. They saw Qin He smiling as if nothing had happened. Lu Qin frowned, and he pondered deeply for a moment before he said, "You have to personally tell Master about this matter." I have already reported it to Lord True Lord." Xueying smiled and used a gentle voice to interrupt Lu Qin's words and said, "He has approved." Lord True Lord Tianlan had approved Xueying's request? Lu Qin's expression changed again, and he could not help but look up at Xueying's smiling face. After a while he said, "That is good." Then he turned to look at Qin He, and this time his face was full of smiles, and said, "There are a lot of evildoers in the Western continent, Brother Qin will have to work hard in the future." Qin He shook his head and said with a smile, No, we are all working for Lord True Lord. For the sake of his grand plans, it is only our duty." Lu Qin and old Ma looked at each other and then looked away. The two sides chatted happily for a while, and then Lu Qin and old Ma said goodbye, but they were very quiet on the road. After walking for a while, old Ma lowered his voice and asked, "Lord True Lord did not tell you about these things?" Lu Qin shook his head, and just as he was about to speak, he found that he and old Ma had walked to the row of houses where the elite disciples of the Kunlun party were. Lu Qin was silent for a moment and looked at the familiar house and suddenly asked, "White Lotus is still living in Su Qingjuan's house, right?" Old Ma grunted and was about to say something, when he suddenly saw someone coming from the road in front of them, and turned into the row of houses about 100 feet away from them. From afar it was He who they had not seen for a while. Old Ma frowned and muttered, "That person's cultivation is not bad, he seems to have a fierce murderous aura." Chapter 573. He didn't seem to notice Lu Qin and old Ma coming from afar. He turned into the back of the row of houses expressionlessly and soon disappeared. Lu Qin glanced at old Ma. Old Ma thought for a moment and said, "He should also be living here. Among the group of people that the Kunlun party transferred here last time, Fiyunji has basically gathered and settled down. But I can't remember which room he lives in exactly now." Lu Qin nodded slightly and didn't say anything. In Kunlun sect, he was a proud son of heaven with boundless glory, an outstanding talent among the young generation of disciples. But after coming to the Immortal City, because the true Immortal Alliance had gathered the most outstanding talents in the world, not to mention others, there were 5 to 6 deity transformation stage perfected cultivators who stood at the peak of the human cultivation world, and there were even more nascent soul stage perfected cultivators, who would pay special attention to one of the countless Jindan stage cultivators. In a place like the Immortal City where all the power and precious resources in the world were gathered, to a certain extent, the importance of the cultivation of an ordinary cultivator was much less than in other places. The people here were more used to looking at a person's background and identity to judge his strength. This was a kind of alienation but also a kind of reality. For example, Lu Chen's cultivation and realm were obscure and hard to understand. On the surface he might not be stronger than He Yi, but in the Immortal City, his reputation was undoubtedly 100 times better than He Yi's. Whether it was Lu Chen or Old Ma, they both had a lot of troubles at the moment, and He had never done anything out of line or eye-catching since he came to the Immortal City, so they didn't care about him. Because of the incident with He Gang, Lu Chen naturally had a kind of vigilance and alienation towards He Yi, but now he didn't have any thoughts of targeting this person. The past was over and the secrets were covered in dust. No one would ever mention the past again. Lu Chen shook his head slightly, tossing those memories aside. He then said to Old Ma in a low voice, "Just now in Fiyunji, you didn't show any dissatisfaction in front of Blood Warbler, did you?" Old Ma was startled. His expression turned solemn, and he recalled for a while with some seriousness. Then he shook his head and said, "No, from the beginning to the end I had a smile on my face. There was absolutely no anger or annoyance on my face." Lu Chen glanced at him, snorted coldly and said, "So you are unhappy in your heart?" Old Ma rolled his eyes and said, "If it were you, would you still be happy?" "Of course not." Lu Chen admitted to this point very straightforwardly. Then, his expression darkened slightly as he said, "Blood Warbler called Chin He over in front of us and purposely brought up this matter. Could it be that she's trying to show off to us? Recently she has been getting more and more out of hand." Old Ma frowned. His first reaction was not to reply, but to look around first. Seeing that there was no one around them, only the two of them, he let out a sigh of relief. Then he said in a low voice, "Even if you want to complain, let's find a safe place with no one to curse, okay?" "There is no one around here," Lu Chen said calmly. "Otherwise Atsu will find out." "Atsu?" Old Ma was shocked and said, "Didn't it just run to—" Before he finished speaking, Old Ma saw a dog's head poking out from the corner of a house in front of them. It glanced at them and then yawned lazily. It was Atsu. Old Ma swallowed the words that he didn't want to say. He looked at Atsu and clicked his tongue. "I've watched this dog grow up. He has changed so much. I don't know what he ate, but he seems to have become a demon." Old Ma was speechless. Lu Chen ignored Old Ma's praise for Atsu and just waved at Atsu. Old Ma saw this from the side and subconsciously thought that Atsu would probably be like those legendary assassins who appeared and disappeared without a trace with a whoosh, and then suddenly jump out at a critical moment to deal a fatal blow. In the end, the black dog lay on the ground and buried its head between its two front paws. It looked like it was sunbathing and getting ready to sleep. Lu Chen's movement froze and he cursed. It sounded like he was exasperated at Old Ma's failure to meet his expectations, but other than that he did not express anything else. He pulled Old Ma and continued to walk forward, but he still lowered his voice. "What are you thinking about?" Old Ma was quite straightforward and said, "Right now the entire Floating Clouds agency knows that I'm one of your people. However, True Monarch has prevented me from leaving, yet you've agreed to Blood Warbler's request. Isn't this somewhat inappropriate?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment and said, "The damn Baldy has always been strange, and his actions are always unexpected. It is hard to say." After a pause, Lu Chen said, "However, I have been in the limelight recently, and Shuang has been in charge of Fiyunji for many years. She has always been known as the #1 person under Tianlan. The damn Baldy probably did this because he weighed the pros and cons." Old Ma sighed and said, "Is he sacrificing a small fry like me to comfort the other side?" Lu Chen glanced at him and said, "Don't talk nonsense about sacrifice. I didn't ask you to die." Old Ma smiled bitterly and said, "Fortunately, those big shots outside don't know about our little business. Otherwise, if they send someone to kill him, how are you going to defend yourself in front of perfected immortal?" Lu Chen also laughed and said, "What's the big deal? I will just say that you did it." He patted Old Ma's shoulder and said with a smile, "Anyway, you are already dissatisfied. You have the motive and we don't want to talk about the means. The murder is you." "Bah." Old Ma spat angrily, "You are the most useless boss I have ever worked for." Lu Chen laughed. He sat in his room. The door was closed, the window was closed, and even the curtains were drawn, so the room was very dark and quiet. It was probably because of this that the hearty laughter from outside could be heard from afar, causing him to raise his head and look in the direction of the door. His face was still young and handsome. He was still high-spirited and had achievements that many people envied and yearned for. He dreamed that one day he could become the second Lu Qin, and then he would have no regrets in his life. But in He Yi's heart there was a lot of regret and hatred. In fact, sometimes he also had some doubts. His achievements were obviously good enough, but he was always not satisfied. He lowered his head. The dim light fell on his face, only illuminating half of his cheeks. He seemed to be sitting in the boundary between light and darkness. He seemed to be thinking but also seemed to be hesitating. He was like a child standing on the edge of a cliff. In front of him was the most beautiful flower in the world, but below his feet was a bottomless abyss. Should he take this step? He slowly pulled out his long sword. The sword light reflected in his eyes, like a ghost in the dark. He didn't know how long he sat like this. It was quiet around him until the sky outside the room darkened and his room was completely plunged into darkness. Late at night. He slowly raised his head, stood up with his sword, and then opened the door and walked out. Chapter 574. In the dead of night, the wind blew from the northwest, bringing with it a bit of coldness. It circled above Mount Tianlong, letting out a mournful whine as it whizzed past. The night was dark and somber. Dark clouds covered the sky, and the usual moon and stars could not be seen. The trees on the mountain also seemed to be shivering in the wind. It was a dark and windy night. He walked silently in the shadows. His weapon had already been sheathed and he was also dressed in a dark robe. He seemed to have blended in with the darkness, and it was almost impossible to notice that there was a figure quietly moving forward at the edge of the darkness. There was no trace of anyone around, but there were many buildings and pavilions in the distance. Those were the halls of Zhengxianmeng. Many of them were built tall and magnificent, and even in the dark night, they looked extraordinary. Like a giant in the day, like a giant beast in the night. However, in the dead of night, most of these places were dark and quiet. Even if one or two lights were lit occasionally, it was like the light of a firefly, shining faintly in the dark night, but not far away. He walked forward quietly. His face was expressionless. Although he looked young, he seemed to be faintly tired. However, his eyes were still as bright as ever, as if to prove that he had not given up on his first dream, and that he still had enthusiasm and yearning for the future. Although the road under his feet was longer than he had thought, he still had to walk until the final peak. Sometimes he would think that he would probably be able to breathe a sigh of relief on that day. His younger brother had died so early and so miserably. Now he was the only one who could fulfill the wishes of the two brothers when they first climbed up Mount Kunlun. Even his younger brother's share had been completed together. The night wind was really a bit cold. Although He had already cultivated and was not afraid of this mere chill, he still seemed to pull at his clothes subconsciously. The surrounding night was like a wide layer of black gauze, protecting his whereabouts. His eyes were searching in the night, quietly moving towards a predetermined direction. That place should not be too far away and he was almost there. For some reason he suddenly became a little distracted. At that moment he suddenly felt that he seemed to be like a mysterious figure in the past, a shadow. Those mysterious shadows that belonged to Fiyunji. Fiyunji was the most powerful hall in Zhengxianmeng, and those mysterious and strange shadows hidden in the dark were its most terrifying power. There were many kinds of shadows, but in the eyes of outsiders, there were two kinds that were the most terrifying. One was the killer and the other was the spy. An assassin in the darkness could kill anyone, but an insider would destroy everything that was originally as firm as a rock. What's more, in the legends, the things hidden in the depths of the Floating Clouds Agency, the most terrifying shadows, had already combined these two identities into one. It was said that the once prosperous devil cult, the powerful devil cult that once fought against the orthodox cultivation world, was destroyed by such a shadow. He felt the chill on his body getting heavier. All the shadows in Fiyunji belonged to the high and mighty Lord Tianlan. It was precisely because of such terrifying power and his unfathomable strength that Lord Tianlan could become the world's most powerful person today. He suddenly thought of Lu Qin. Of course he was not unfamiliar with that person. In the past he had several disputes with this person, and even in the depths of the southern land of chaos, he once killed this person and knocked him out of Longshuan. Of course he thought that this person was already dead, and he was very proud to repay Lord Tianlan, looking forward to using this merit to move the Divine Transformation Lord's heart, so that he would accept him as a disciple. In the end, none of this happened. He used to be very confused, but a few years later, on Mount Celestial Dragon, he saw with his own eyes the scene of Lord Tianlan accepting Lu Qin as a disciple. His face was calm, but at that moment, his heart was completely filled with despair. After all, the world was full of malice towards people like him who struggled to become immortal. In order to please Lord Tianlan, after a painful struggle, he did not hesitate to kill his master and Dukan Jinren, who had raised him into a talent. Until today he often saw the look his master gave him before he died, and then woke up with a cold sweat all over his body. In the same way, in order to please the bald lord, he spared no effort to hunt him down for thousands of miles, but in the end not only did he end up in vain, but Tianlan actually accepted Lu Qin as a disciple? What did this mean? It was clear that there was some kind of secret relationship between them a long time ago, but he had been hiding it from him. At the moment when he saw the apprenticeship ceremony, he had never felt the pain of being fooled and humiliated like this. He felt that every smile of the master and disciple was aimed at him, with coldness and ridicule that went deep into his bones. His loyalty to Tianlan and his attachment to Kunlun were silently shattered at that moment. He knew that he had no future in the power of Lord Tianlan, and sooner or later, there would only be an unexpected disaster and an accidental death waiting for him. Even until now, neither Tianlan nor Lu Qin took any action against him. Because he asked himself honestly, if he were in Tianlan's position, he would definitely not let go of an enemy who tried to kill him. He had no way to go and there was no place for him to retreat. He had to fight to the death. He looked up and saw the house. He came here to the last destination of the night. In the silent night, the night that enveloped Sky Dragon Mountain was the same as usual. At the beginning there was no difference until suddenly in a hall in the night, a shrill scream rang out. That scream was sharp and resounding and seemed to carry some anger and doubt. But then another angry and crisp voice rang out, resounding through the nearby mountains. In the dark night, in a moment, many lights were lit up. In some places that reacted quickly, there were already people holding torches and rushing out, approaching the place where the scream came from. However, before the crowd could get close, there was a sudden change in the dark night. A bright and dazzling firework suddenly shot up into the sky with a shrill scream, shooting straight into the vault of heaven, blossoming with unparalleled dazzling light, and then exploded with a loud bang in the sky. Like a sudden clap of thunder, it caused the mountains to shake, and immediately startled the entire Sky Dragon Mountain. For a moment, in the near and far, countless lights were lit up. It was unknown how many people were awakened from their dreams, and then raised their eyes to look at the sky. When they saw the firework that turned into a brilliant rain of flowers slowly falling from the sky, some were stunned, some were doubtful, and some suddenly changed their expressions. After a moment, suddenly, a low old voice that seemed to contain infinite power suddenly rang out in the night sky, as if a god had descended, causing the wind and clouds to roll. "How dare you? Who dares to bully my Taihu's daughter?" The mountains shook and the heavens and the earth were shocked. Chapter 575. Mount Tianlong was the location of the headquarters of Zhengxianmeng. As the #1 rich and powerful organization in the world and the leader of the righteous path, this place had become the center of the world of cultivation, like the capital of a dynasty. Many cultivators, including the immortal city at the foot of the mountain, yearned for this place, flocked from all directions and gathered here. There were 6 deity stage cultivators in this huge mountain range, and the rest of the Yuanying, Jindan and Foundation establishment cultivators were innumerable. Therefore, when the thunderous roar suddenly resounded in the sky, the entire celestial dragon mountain seemed to have been jolted awake from a dream of the dark night and woke up in an instant. Looking from a distance, one could clearly see many light spots swaying between the mountain peaks, and it was obvious that they were moving and gathering in the direction of the accident. Further away, one could vaguely see the residences of several other big shots. There didn't seem to be much movement, but the lights were also lit up, as if they were watching the situation from afar. Under the sky, in the boundless night, an indescribably powerful force fell from the sky, landing on the top of the pavilion that did not look particularly majestic. At this time, many people had quickly gathered in the nearby mountains. Most of them were awakened and came to watch the show, or some had some other thoughts. In addition, there was a group of people dressed neatly and in the same style. They were the people of Tianlai Hall. Compared to the other unorganized and somewhat disorderly idlers, the actions of the Heavenly Law Hall's side were obviously much more decisive. After all, the one who had bellowed earlier was the boss of the Heavenly Law Hall, true monarch Jianghu. Therefore, it did not take long before the elite troops of the Heavenly Law Hall, which seemed to have at least 100 people, had already passed through the crowd and tightly surrounded the small building that had a signboard with the words Tingyu Building written on it. At the same time, on the top of this small building, a person was floating in the void, with a powerful momentum, an angry face, and a slightly low cultivation that made people dare not look directly at him. It was the leader of Tianlai Hall, Immortality. In the distance there were more people rushing over in the night. It was not that these people were fools who did not know that mortals would avoid a fight between immortals, but this was where the headquarters of Zhang Xianming was located. How could there be a powerful enemy who dared to come here? Seriously, in such a place, deity stage Immortal Jianghu had some scruples, and the incident happened suddenly. Everyone had to take a few more glances and gather more information, which was beneficial without harm. Maybe in the future, when the big shots in their own mountains asked, they would have something to say. Well, the above were all superficial words. Nowadays, the devil cult had been suppressed, and the true immortal alliance had unified the world. Who would dare to provoke them? Everyone had nothing to do anyway, so they all came over to watch a good show. Furthermore, the deity transformation stage perfected cultivator's words seemed to imply that the beautiful Song Wenji seemed to have been bullied. There was no lack of smart people in this world. There was no such thing as an impenetrable wall in this world. Rumors, gossip, and the like never stopped on this celestial dragon mountain. It was just that because of various reasons, it could not be put out in the open. But how could some shady matters in private be completely hidden from people? Therefore, more and more people were curious, excited, and ran over. And those with deep minds had already taken this opportunity to secretly think if there were any opportunities that could be used. Father. The Tingyu building, which was tightly surrounded by the crowd, suddenly came a cry from the inside of the building, which seemed to be tight on the inside but loose on the outside. A moment later, a female figure opened the door of the building and staggered out. The flashing light shone on the woman, and there was a sudden commotion in the crowd. Many people even cried out involuntarily. The person who ran out was Song Wenji. However, her current appearance was a little embarrassing. Her originally charming face had lost all color, and her clothes were in a mess. There were a few places where her clothes were torn, revealing her snow-white shoulders and some skin on her chest. Under the light of the fire, she looked haggard and heart-wrenching, but faintly, she had a different kind of charm and beauty. After the hubbub, the crowd soon quieted down again. Some quick-witted people had already gasped and subconsciously looked up at the night sky. Sure enough, Immortal Jianghu, who saw this scene in midair, was so angry that his whole body trembled. His voice was like thunder as he shouted, "Shameless scum, so bold for lust. Quickly come out and accept your death." At that moment, many people looked at the Tingyu building, only to see that there was no candlelight inside. It was pitch black and they could not see clearly who was inside. However, everyone's eyes were filled with surprise and curiosity. They thought to themselves, how could there be such an ignorant person on Mount Tianlong who doesn't know what's good for him? How dare he touch the exclusive property of a deity transformation stage immortal? Seeing Immortal Jianghu stamping with rage in midair, in such a situation, unless the other 5 deity transformation stage immortals came out, there should be no one who could protect the life of the extremely bold perverted thief in the building. As for whether the other 5 deity transformation stage immortals would come out or not, there was no need to think about it. Definitely not. For such a thing to come out, how could a true immortal keep his face? Song Wenji cried bitterly at Immortal Jianghu in midair, kneeling on the ground and shaking her shoulders, looking very painful and sad. However, at some point in time, her eyes still swept across the crowd in the distance from the corner of her eyes. Then, she quickly saw a certain person in the crowd, as well as the few expert guards who quietly followed behind that person to protect him. She withdrew her gaze and continued to cry, as if she was really very sad. He looked at the road under his feet. The darkness of the night covered everything, making the road in front of him look very blurry. Just a little bit further and it completely blended into the darkness, as if there was no way to go, but also as if there were countless possibilities, luring him to take that step. The sound of hurried footsteps had already gone far away, and the guards who were set up to protect that person naturally followed. The person who was quietly squatting in the shadows outside the house slowly stood up, like an evil ghost quietly crawling out of the night. The road under his feet was neither long nor short, it was still the same as before, but the person walking had changed. If he turned back now, would it still be too late? This last thought flashed across He Yi's mind, and then he silently shook his head, expressionlessly smiling bitterly to himself in his heart. This world was so cruel, when had it ever given people like him so many choices? Since he had decided he should go, there was no turning back. He pulled out his sword, reflecting a cold light in the night, and then stepped out. In 2 or 3 steps he reached the side of the wall and then jumped over. Landing noiselessly, in front of him was the bedroom in the backyard, one of which was still lit, not knowing if it had been awakened by the movement just now. He quietly walked to the bedroom door, and heard a child call out softly from inside. "Mother, I'm so sleepy." There was a gentle female voice hurriedly comforting him with a bit of love and warmth. He could even feel the taste of beauty and happiness from it. He slightly lowered his head, looking at the long sword in his hand. The night wind was cold, blowing through his clothes and hair. His hand faintly trembled, but very quickly steadied. After a moment, he took a deep breath, gritted his teeth, and went forward to gently push the door. With a low creak, the door slowly opened. Chapter 576. Lu Qin and Old Ma lived together. Of course, there was also a black dog. They had a good sleep that night, but were awakened by the explosion of fireworks on the mountain and the thunderous voice of immortal Jianghu. It was rare for a perfected cultivator of the divine transformation realm to be so angry. Not to mention that it was rarely seen, it probably would not happen once in a decade or two. Therefore, when Lu Qin and Old Ma figured out what had happened on the mountain, they were both shocked. However, after staying for a long time in the true immortal alliance where undercurrents were surging and scheming against each other, they naturally, as if instinctively, immediately thought of more things. Lu Qin frowned and thought for a while, then asked Old Ma, "When was the last time an old man of the divine transformation realm got angry in public like this?" Old Ma pondered for a while, then shook his head and said, "I can't remember." Lu Qin glanced at him and Old Ma asked, "Do you want to go up the mountain to have a look?" Lu Qin hesitated for a moment and said, "Let's go there. It's already like this and things will definitely get out of hand. What's the use of not going there? We have to understand what happened." Of course, this was reasonable and Old Ma also nodded in agreement. In addition, there was another reason that they did not say out loud. In fact, they both knew in their hearts that although there were a lot of outstanding cultivators in Zhangxianming, most of them still belonged to the top few perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm, and there were many conflicts between them. They were important figures in perfected cultivator Qianlan's faction, and it was not appropriate for them to stay out of this at this time. If perfected cultivator Tianlan asked them about this in the future, it would be very bad if they could not say anything. Therefore, the two brought Atsu, who had just been woken up and seemed a little unhappy and depressed, to Mount Celestial Dragon. The night was still very dark, but the startled people on Mount Celestial Dragon soon woke up. On the way, Lu Qin and Old Ma saw many torches and more figures. Obviously, many people had the same mentality as them. After all, this was a soul formation perfected Lord's show. It would be a waste not to watch it. Regardless of whether it was useful in the future, he would have something to brag about. Therefore, when Lu Qin and Old Ma rushed to the rain-listening building at the fastest speed, the small building had already been tightly surrounded by numerous people. Lu Qin pulled on Old Ma and the two of them climbed up a big tree on the other side. Anyway, there were many people in the dark, so there was nothing to be ashamed of. However, the troublesome thing was that after they climbed up the tree, they found that the tree was already full of people. It seemed that everyone in the world was the same. Even cultivators couldn't change their curiosity and loved to watch the fun. Finally squeezing out two places to stand, Lu Qin and Old Ma were happy and immediately looked forward. As for Atsu, he didn't want to join in the fun with these stupid humans. He just lay under the tree yawning and looking sleepy. Song Wenji? After seeing the situation in front of the rain-listening building clearly, Lu Qin was startled and said with a little astonishment. Old Ma also recognized the woman who was kneeling in front of the rain-savoring building and crying very sadly. He also clearly saw Song Wenji's somewhat messy and torn clothes. Suddenly his complexion changed slightly. Then, he glanced at the extremely frightening figure with a monstrous aura floating in the sky. He lowered his voice and said, "Which idiot dares to touch this woman on this mountain?" Lu Qin nodded and also showed a puzzled expression. He frowned and kept looking at the rain-listening building. Suddenly, Jianghu Real Lord shouted again in midair, angrily said, "Perverted thief! Still not coming out to die? You dare to do it but don't dare to admit it?" Everyone's eardrums were buzzing from this big shot's angry shout, and they were all shocked. Almost all the people present were cultivators, and there was no lack of cultivators who had cultivated for many years. But at a glance, almost everyone's expression changed. It was conceivable that the cultivation of a deity transformation stage immortal was really unfathomable. However, from the beginning until now, aside from Song Wenji running out of the building in tears, there was actually no movement from inside. It was unknown if the so-called pervert was scared out of his wits by the soul formation true monarch and didn't dare to come out. But everyone knew that in this situation, with Immortal Jianghu blocking this small building, unless there were other deity transformation stage immortals coming out, otherwise looking at Immortal Jianghu's furious look, there would definitely be blood splattered on the spot today. As for whether you came out or not, it didn't matter at all. Now it was just that Immortal Jianghu was unwilling to take action because of his status, but later on he would be impatient and tear down this small building, which was just a small effort. Sure enough, Immortal Jianghu, who was in mid-air, not knowing whether he was provoked by the person in the small building below, or seeing Song Wenji's pitiful appearance after a shout, he flipped his palm. Suddenly, a huge palm shadow appeared in the sky and directly hit down on the rain-listening building. In front of the rain-listening building, Song Wenji exclaimed and covered her body with her clothes, but her feet were not slow and she lightly dodged. Thus, under the astonished gazes of everyone, the gigantic palm image landed with a loud bang. With a ka-ka-ka-ka sound, the small building was directly crushed down as if it was a piece of rotten wood, and with a loud bang, it turned into a pile of broken wood and ruins. It was crushed just like that? There was no sound from the person inside until now? If there was really someone inside and if his cultivation was not strong enough, he probably was already dead? Outside the rain-listening building, a large number of people were dumbfounded. Everyone knew that Immortal Jianghu was very angry now, but no one expected that this old man would actually make such a heavy move. Lu Chen suddenly heard several gasps around him, and even his expression changed slightly. This move was indeed very powerful, but everyone had seen the world. Although they were usually very respectful of deity transformation stage immortals, they were not completely frightened by this move. Most of the people who could stand here today were those who could survive in Zhangxianmeng, and how many of them were fools? In a rage, he killed with one blow, and the murderer did not even have a chance to appeal. Who knew what was going on in the rain-listening building in the dark? Everyone only saw Song Wenji's tattered clothes, but there were all kinds of strange things in Zhangxianmeng, so who knew what was going on in the rain-listening building? Everyone was silent. After a while, suddenly they heard the elites of the Heavenly Law Hall in the innermost part of the crowd loudly praising. What they said was nothing more than praising Immortal Jianghu for eliminating evil for the people, upholding justice and so on. The people on the outside looked at each other in dismay, no one answered. After a while, True Lord Taihu landed back on the ground and stood beside Song Wenji. Song Wenji let out a cry and threw herself into his arms, crying non-stop. Immortal Jianghu showed a loving expression and comforted her in a low voice. It's okay, it's okay. At this time, someone had already gone to check and clean the ruins of the rain-listening building. The surrounding people all looked over there, wondering who was so unlucky in the building. Lu Chen was watching attentively and suddenly felt old Ma pulling him. He turned his head and asked in a low voice, "What's wrong?" Old Ma did not speak and only pointed at their feet, which was the bottom of the big tree, with his mouth. Lu Chen looked down and saw that He was standing beside Atu at some point in time. Of course he knew Atsu, so he was looking around, seemingly looking for Lu Chen, but of course he did not find him. After a while he seemed to think of something and looked up. Lu Chen and old Ma waved to him. He smiled and nodded to them with a gentle expression. Lu Chen smiled back, and at the same time his eyes swept over He's back. He could see 2 or 3 figures standing in the shadows, neither far nor near, following He all the time. He smiled and did not say anything. At this time, there was a sudden commotion in front, and someone shouted in the ruins. They found a person, or to be exact, a dead person. Chapter 577. After greeting each other, Lu Chen, old Ma, and He remained standing on the tree. Everyone looked away. Lu Chen had no intention of going down, and He did not show any signs of climbing up the tree. After standing for a while, He seemed to feel that this was not a good place, so he walked to the side and quickly walked into the crowd on the other side. The seemingly ordinary figures behind him also followed him like shadows. Seeing that those people had gone far away, old Ma softly snorted. Lu Chen frowned and said, "What's wrong?" Old Ma said, "This person's ambition is not small. He is not willing to be under someone else for long. He may become a disaster in the future." Lu Chen laughed and turned to look at old Ma. He said, "I didn't expect you to have mastered the mind-reading skill. Come, tell me, how did you see through it in the blink of an eye?" Old Ma said seriously, "We are standing on this branch, but he feels uncomfortable under it and would rather walk away. It is obvious that he is dissatisfied." Lu Chen shook his head with a smile and said, "Don't tell me that you're holding a grudge against him because he snatched something good from you? Of course I don't think much of him. Old Ma calmly admitted it. However, there was a solemn expression on his face as he said, "It doesn't matter how he treats me. However, given your current status, if he abandons you and joins Shuiying, not only will he not be punished, he will even be given great things. What will others think if they see this?" Lu Chen was silent for a moment, then said with a slightly self-deprecating tone, "They probably think that I have fallen out of favor with that damn Baldy?" Old Ma snorted coldly and did not say anything. When they met by chance just now, both sides were very polite and friendly. But everyone could also feel that the atmosphere between the two was different from before. After Qin he was forced by Lu Chen to join Zhang Xianming's side. He could be considered a person who knew when to pick up and when to let go. He immediately joined Lu Chen's faction and worked hard for him. He also paid special attention to the matter of hunting down the evil sect. To put it nicely, it was abandoning the dark for the light. To put it bluntly, it was probably turning against him. Of course, Lu Chen's plan had pushed him too far and made him a mortal enemy of the evil sect. Qin He did not have much choice. But now that time had passed, Qin He only seemed to be friendly towards Lu Chen on the surface. Just now when he was under the tree he even seemed a little unhappy when he raised his head to look at him. Then, if he achieved something in the future and had power and influence when he faced Lu Chen, would he remember that Lu Chen had also plotted against him? "It's so damn hard to live well in this broken place like Zhang Xianming," Lu Chen suddenly cursed. Old Ma sighed at the side, patted his shoulder with his hand, and then said in a low and sympathetic tone, "I understand how you feel and I sympathize with you. Don't talk nonsense, the whole Sky Dragon Mountain knows that you and I are best friends. If others want to deal with me they will probably kill you first before killing me." Lu Chen very politely interrupted Old Ma's comfort. Old Ma's expression changed greatly, and then he also cursed something like, "What the hell?" But these two people were people who had been in this damn Zhang Xianming for many years, so they quickly put aside those boring and useless emotions and began to discuss the solution later. "Looking at your sneaky and thoughtful look, you must have come up with some evil idea in your mind, right?" Lu Chen looked at Old Ma and said seriously. Old Ma looked at Lu Chen with contempt and then said, "The things you have done are much more ruthless than me. Anyway, since things have come to this, why not make the first move?" Lu Chen didn't think much and shook his head, saying, "Behave yourself these days, don't mess around." Old Ma frowned and said, "When he really goes far away and goes to the western continent, it will be difficult to deal with." Lu Chen said lightly, "We haven't really reached the point where we are enemies of life and death. Let's wait and see, no hurry. Moreover, the Immortal Alliance has not been peaceful recently, let's wait and see first." As he said this, he seemed to think of something and looked up at the dark night sky above his head. Old Ma also seemed to understand what he meant. After a moment of silence, he also nodded and seemed to agree with Lu Chen's idea. But he still seemed to be a little unwilling. After smacking his lips twice, he suddenly said, "Anyway, seeing him like a villain intoxicated by success makes me uncomfortable. If I knew this day would come, I would have let that little girl White Lotus teach him a little more. By the way, I haven't seen White Lotus for a while, do you know where she went?" Lu Chen said indifferently, "I didn't see her either. Maybe she is still staying in Su Qingjuan's room and is too lazy to go out. Well, there seems to be a dead person carried out over there. His whole body is so soft even his bones are broken? A deity severing is really powerful, but to be able to do this, hey." The atmosphere in the vicinity of the rain-savoring building on the Celestial Dragon Mountain had always been a little weird. Though nobody stood out to openly question Immortal Jianghu or say anything else, all the cheers and rebukes were from the people of Heavenly Law Hall, which sounded a little weird. Fortunately, Immortal Jianghu did not have the intention to be entangled here any longer. He casually said a few words like, "The perverted thief is extremely daring, provoking the Tai Sui, seeking his own death." He then brought along the beautiful and sorrowful Song Wenji and left. After this big shot left, the scene suddenly became lively. Many people squeezed forward, wanting to see who the dead person was and that there were other clues in the rain-savoring building that had been turned into ruins from time to time, so that they could find out what had happened before. That's right, even though Immortal Jianghu personally appeared to punish them and intimidate everyone, the intelligent people of the true Immortal Alliance who were used to seeing crafty plots and conspiracies still didn't really believe it on this point. Even at deity transformation stage, Immortal couldn't suppress his curiosity and guess. It could be seen that this was the usual atmosphere. However, although Tai Hu Immortal had left, the people of Heavenly Law Hall still surrounded the place and kept the corpse. Some people were dissatisfied and shouted in the crowd to show everyone which idiot had eaten a bear's heart and a leopard's heart to dare to provoke the young miss of the Heavenly Law Hall. However, the Heavenly Law Hall just turned a blind eye and directly left. The onlookers were naturally full of doubts. They only felt that the incident tonight seemed to be full of strangeness, and that something was not quite right. But since it had come to this, everyone could only gradually disperse. Lu Qin and old Ma brought Atu, who looked like he had almost fallen asleep again, back to where they came from. While they were discussing this matter in a low voice, they suddenly heard an extremely sharp howl coming from another place on the Heavenly Dragon Mountain. The faces of Lu Qin and old Ma changed at the same time. The direction from which the sound came was from Fiyunji, and it sounded like an extremely urgent alarm signal. Chapter 578. The large group of people who were about to disperse, those who were walking in the light and those who were about to disappear into the darkness, suddenly paused. It was as if someone had suddenly cast an unfathomable Dao technique in divine ability, and all the sounds were instantly erased. Everyone turned their heads and looked in the direction of the shrill alarm, which was also the direction of Fiyunji, and even Kunlun Temple, which had recently become very popular on Mount Tianlong. Lu Qin and old Ma looked at each other and their expressions changed. The level of the alarm in Fiyunji was not low. Something big must have happened. Why is it so unpeaceful tonight? What happened in Fiyunji? Old Ma could not help but complain to Lu Qin in a low voice. Lu Qin also shook his head with a hint of caution on his face. He frowned as he looked at the gradually brightening Fiyunji's territory in the distance, and there were more lights gradually gathering in that direction. No matter what, the two of them were on the same side as Fiyunji and Lord Tianlan, so it was reasonable for them to go back and take a look. After getting down from the tree, they called Atsu and rushed to Fiyunji Temple. There were many people along the way. Obviously they had heard the noise and ran there. Lu Qin walked quickly as he looked around. He saw that there were familiar faces and unfamiliar faces, but most of them had grave expressions. It was as if they were deeply worried about the floating clouds company, or if they didn't do so, they wouldn't be able to express their goodwill. However, who would know what was really in other people's hearts? Maybe some people were burning with anxiety, maybe some people were gloating, and maybe some people just wanted to look on coldly, not caring about the big or small disasters, and only seeing if there was a chance to gain benefits. There must be all kinds of such things. For a moment, Lu Qin suddenly felt that it was a little funny. The alliance of true immortals commanded the world and was majestic. It looked extraordinary on the surface, but the people who were really in the core of the alliance of true immortals were probably already used to scheming against each other. Not knowing if it was because Lu Qin had been silent, old Ma was a little anxious. He approached him a little nervously. First, he looked around to make sure that no one was too close, and then he said in a very low voice that only Lu Qin could hear, "Could it be that something happened to Lord Zhangxianming?" Lu Qin's footsteps suddenly stopped, and his expression changed. His sudden stop startled old Ma and Atsu. Old Ma saw that he didn't look good and quickly said, "I'm just guessing. Don't take it seriously. I'm just afraid that..." Lu Qin shook his head slightly. After a moment of silence he said, "I don't blame you." Speaking of this, he paused for a moment and then said calmly, "I can't think of anyone who can secretly plot against a person like the damn Baldy. You should be fine." Old Ma replied with a It seemed that he had no objection to Lu Qin's words. His expression relaxed and then he strode forward. Lu Qin followed him, looking at old Ma's back with a somewhat complicated expression. When old Ma suddenly asked him this question just now, to be honest, he had never thought that something might happen to Lord Tianlan when the alarm sounded. But at that moment, his heart suddenly beat faster in his chest. Why was that? Was he worried or was he expecting something? His sober reason had always firmly controlled his body and will, so that he knew what was the right thing to do. But in his mind and in the depths of his heart, had he ever thought about that kind of secret freedom? Had he really hoped that person would die? Lu Qin looked at the hall that was getting closer and closer and gradually showing its outline, and suddenly quickened his pace. As the most powerful hall in Zhangxianming, Fiyunji did not get its reputation by bragging. Its efficiency and strength were actually far better than other mountain forces. Therefore, when these people just arrived near the edge of Fiyunji's territory, they found that the situation here was not quite the same as in the rain-savoring tower. The people of Fiyunji had completely controlled the surroundings. They were heavily guarded and the atmosphere was somber. Everyone was blocked outside. Those outsiders were blocked by the stern-looking and solemn guards of Fiyunji. Although they were dissatisfied, everyone could see that something serious must have happened in Fiyunji's territory at the moment. If there was a dispute, the arrogant soldiers of Fiyunji would not be polite and show mercy. And those who belonged to Fiyunji were quickly recognized or reported their identities. Then they were quickly summoned and distributed to various places in an orderly manner, further strengthening the defense around Fuyunji. Therefore this territory became more and more stable. In the dark, a large group of people were blocked outside, sticking their heads out and looking around in the silent and somber atmosphere. It was completely different from the situation in the rain-savoring tower. Lu Qin and Old Ma rushed here. After they came forward and showed their identities, they were quickly let in. With Lu Qin's identity, he was now one of the 3 core figures under Supreme Tianlan. His future was limitless. Therefore, everyone thought highly of him and naturally would not let him do the work of guarding. Lu Qin led Old Ma and Atsu directly through the crowd. Under the guidance and whispers of the people next to him, they went to the place where the incident happened. Old Ma followed him and heard a few words. His expression slowly changed into a complicated and shocked expression, and even the corners of his eyes were slightly twitching. Lu Qin kept a sullen face and did not speak. He walked quickly through the main hall of Fuyunji, but did not go in the direction of the Kunlun Hall. Instead, he took a detour in another direction. The night there looked particularly deep and dark. The wind blew from the front, carrying with it a faint smell of blood. After walking for a while, they could vaguely see a house there. There were already many people surrounding it, and there were many familiar faces among them, including Xueying and the other top figures of the Floating Clouds division. At this moment they were all here. Lu Qin walked over with large strides. Hearing his footsteps, Xueying turned her head and glanced in his direction. When she saw Lu Qin, her charming face was as cold as ice, but she didn't show any hostility towards him. She only nodded slightly, which could be considered a greeting. Lu Qin walked to her side and was about to speak when they suddenly heard a beast-like howl from behind them. It sounded like a man's heart-wrenching cry. There was also a low sound, as if someone inside had lost control and hit the wall or knocked over something. A few fires lit up in the dark house. A commotion came and a few voices gathered together. It seemed like they had spent a lot of effort to suppress the person who had lost control. Lu Qin and Xueying both looked over there. The wind blew past them, carrying with it a strong smell of blood. It was nauseating. Lu Qin lowered his head slightly. After a moment of silence, he opened his mouth and asked, "Inside?" Xueying's expression was solemn. She sighed softly and said in a low voice, "Very tragic." Lu Qin did not speak. The woman in front of him had seen more of the world than him. If even she said the word "very tragic," there was a moment when Lu Qin did not even want to enter this house. However, Xueying looked at him. For some reason, her gaze was somewhat deep. She said, "Shall we go in and take a look?" Lu Qin frowned and looked at her. His heart sank slightly. After a moment, he nodded and said, "Okay, let's go in and take a look." Chapter 579. Before entering the house, Lu Qin turned around and glanced at Old Ma, who was standing behind him. Atsu was also standing beside Old Ma. However, this black dog was no longer as lazy and sleepy as before. Instead, its eyes were sharp and fierce. It stared at the house with a murderous look as if it wanted to eat someone alive. He didn't know if it was stimulated by the strong smell of blood that drifted in the wind. Old Ma also looked at Lu Qin. His expression was solemn, but there was a hint of worry and anxiety in the depths of his eyes. Lu Qin shook his head slightly. Old Ma was startled for a moment, but then nodded in acknowledgement. After this short silent exchange, Lu Qin turned around and said to Xueying, "Let's go." Xueying did not say anything and walked into the house first. Lu Qin followed half a step behind her. However, just as they were about to enter the door, Lu Qin suddenly heard a few low roars from Atsu behind him. Lu Qin's body paused. He turned around to look and his expression changed slightly. He saw that Old Ma and Atsu were still standing in the same place. However, there were now 4 or 5 people around them. There was originally no one around them, but now there were 4 or 5 people around them. They seemed to be very loose and there was no obvious hostility. However, it was true that they had surrounded them in the middle. Old Ma's expression did not change as if he did not feel anything. However, Atsu did not hold back. They growled fiercely at the few Fuyunji people who were still a distance away from them. Lu Qin was silent for a moment. His expression was already somewhat gloomy. He turned around to look at Xueying and said, "Hallmaster Xue, what is the meaning of this?" Xueying's expression was calm, as if she did not see anything out of the ordinary. She only said softly, "They do not have any ill intentions. It is just that this is an emergency. There must be some suspicious people. Let's just watch for now. There will be no problems." As she said this, she smiled slightly and her expression softened. In this disgusting and bloody night, She was like a beautiful flower that was pleasing to the eye, pleasing to the eye. She stretched out her hand and gestured for them to enter. She calmly smiled and said, "Let's go in and have a look. It is fine outside." Lu Qin looked at this beautiful and famous woman. He stood motionless with an indifferent expression. It was as if he had suddenly become deaf and did not hear what Xueying had just said. Of course, the two of them were not the only ones present. Other than old Ma Atsu and a few people near them, Fiyunji's elite troops had already tightly surrounded this house. There were even more people at the main entrance. Although no one was too close to the two leaders, Xueying and Lu Qin, their every move and word was observed by the surrounding people. Therefore, at that moment, when Lu Qin suddenly disregarded Xueying's words rudely, the atmosphere at the scene suddenly seemed to become cold. The originally somewhat tense surroundings immediately looked over. On the stone steps, Lu Qin indifferently looked at Xueying. He did not take a step, did not move, and did not have any intention of speaking. Sometimes, not speaking actually had another meaning. Perhaps it was to express dissatisfaction. Xueying's expression also changed slightly. It seemed that she did not expect Lu Qin to disregard her words in front of so many people at this critical moment. Moreover, he was clearly looking at her with some provocation. This situation was clearly a little awkward. Xueying felt that she was in a difficult position. She waited for a while, then slowly retracted her extended hand. She then said indifferently, "What is it? Junior Lu, do you have any dissatisfaction with me?" Lu Qin shook his head and said, "I dare not. Hallmaster Xue's reputation is illustrious and her words carry enormous weight. She can do whatever she wants. She can say that whoever she wants is a suspect. She can detain and surround whoever she wants. How could I dare to be dissatisfied with such power?" He said these words very clearly and loudly. In front of the main entrance of the house, who knew how many people in the open and in the dark heard these words clearly at the same time. For a moment there was silence all around. This was probably the first time that the two great figures under Supreme Tianlan, who had always lived in harmony, suddenly erupted into a conflict. In the past many years, Xueying had been the leader of Fiyunji. She was loyal and devoted to Supreme Tianlan, and she was able to lead Fiyunji. She led this powerful and vicious force to fight against the devil cult for many years. Until now, she had almost completely defeated the devil cult and made great achievements. Before Lu Qin appeared, or more accurately, before Supreme Tianlan suddenly held a disciple acceptance ceremony and accepted Lu Qin as his only disciple, Xueying was fully deserving of being Supreme Tianlan's #1 confidant. After that disciple acceptance ceremony, who knew how many people on Mount Celestial Dragon and in Zhengxianming were watching Fiyunji and Xueying? They were full of interest to see how this woman would react. After all, in terms of status, the person who was most likely to inherit Supreme Tianlan's great legacy had suddenly changed from her to the man called Lu Qin. This was a bitter fruit and it was almost impossible to swallow. Perhaps a conflict was inevitable, but to everyone's surprise, Xueying seemed to have no objections, or rather, she accepted everything without any change in expression. During the disciple acceptance ceremony, she followed behind Supreme Tianlan with a smile, doing everything she was supposed to do. On normal days, she and Lu Qin coordinated and adapted to each other, and finally destroyed the last of the devil cult's forces in the Immortal City. No one could not help but praise her, and they could not help but sigh at how unfathomable this woman's thoughts were. Until today she seemed to have finally begun to lose her patience. Facing Lu Qin's somewhat unexpected provocation, she seemed to no longer have the good attitude she had in the past. "Junior brother Lu." Xueying's voice also carried a bit of coldness. She said indifferently, "I don't understand what you're saying. I'm just doing things according to the rules. Now that something has happened in this house, the investigation naturally has to first investigate the suspect and motive. What's wrong with that? Is it worth it for you to humiliate me like this?" She looked at Lu Qin and straightened her back and waist. Just like how she had walked through this dangerous world of men for so many years, she was proud and fearless. She said in a clear voice, "Looks like it's not that I've done anything wrong, but that you already don't like me and are somewhat dissatisfied with me, right?" The surrounding Fiyunji people mostly stood expressionlessly, their heads lowered, or looking into some unknown dark place. If it was possible, there probably weren't many among them who were willing to stand here and listen to these two people start to show off their abilities. And that woman, at this moment, looked like a sword that was slowly being unsheathed. Cold light flashed and the sharpness gradually revealed, causing people's hearts to palpitate. However, when Lu Qin looked over, he didn't seem to feel anything. In front of Xueying's imposing manner, He also didn't seem to have any intention of retreating. He stared fixedly at Shuang. After a while he suddenly opened his mouth and said something that didn't make sense. He said, "Have you acknowledged him as your master?" Shuang was startled and then subconsciously shook her head. Before she could speak, she saw Lu Qin standing there, his gaze suddenly sharp, like a knife that wanted to cut people's hearts, to prick the hidden wounds, to flip over the bloody places and show them to the public. He opened his mouth coldly, and each word was like a flying dagger as he said, "Then what gives you the right to call me Junior Brother Lu? Do you have the right?" He said calmly and coldly. In the night, everyone including old Ma, was stunned at that moment. Then they subconsciously held their breath, leaving only a deathly silence. Chapter 580. On this night, the conflict between Lu Qin and Shuang had come without warning. Furthermore, the intensity of the conflict had exceeded everyone's expectations. In almost an instant, the two most capable subordinates of Supreme Lord Tianlan, who were also the most likely to inherit his legacy, had shed all pretenses of cordiality and directly confronted each other. Of course, although the situation had become unusually tense, if one were to trace back to the source, the biggest reason for the situation to escalate was because Lu Qin had unceremoniously pointed out Shuang. Furthermore, he had done so in front of so many people, most of whom were Fiyunji's subordinates. Faced with Lu Qin's accusation, Shuang could not back down at all. She could only retaliate. In fact, the conflict had been manageable at the beginning. However, Lu Qin seemed determined to blow things up tonight. Especially after he had said that heart-wrenching sentence about whether or not Shuang was qualified, the situation had completely gone out of control. Shui Ying's abilities were extremely strong. Regardless of whether it was in terms of cultivation or in leading a large organization like the Floating Clouds Division, she had always proven herself to be an outstanding leader. She had always been publicly acknowledged as the second most powerful person under True Lord Tianlan. However, everyone in the world knew one fact. Although Supreme Lord Tianlan was talented and bold and his name shook the world, he had never accepted a disciple. Shuang was Supreme Lord Tianlan's subordinate. She was his right-hand man and his trusted aide. However, she was not a disciple of Supreme Lord Tianlan. Lu Qin was only a latecomer. However, Lu Qin was a disciple who had held a disciple ceremony and was personally acknowledged by Supreme Lord Tianlan. He was known by all of Zhangxianming and even the whole world as the person who would inherit Supreme Lord Tianlan's legacy in the future. This was a difference in status. This was a completely different fate. It seemed rather cruel. Do you have the right? Under the night sky, a deathly stillness enveloped the front of the house. Although there was no sound, Lu Chen's mocking and straightforward words still seemed to reverberate in this place, like a whip fiercely lashing at Shui Ying's face. Shui Ying did not have the right to call Lu Qin Junior Brother Lu. No matter how old she was in Fiyunji and how powerful she was still not True Lord Tianlan's disciple and successor. She was just a subordinate, she was just an outsider. In the past, Lu Qin didn't express any objection or disdain towards this form of address. This wasn't a big deal, but now it seemed like he was going to bring this matter up in front of everyone tonight and slap Blood Warbler in the face. He succeeded. At that moment, Blood Warbler was speechless, and the surrounding people held their breaths in silence. Even those who were the most loyal to Blood Warbler and Fiyunji stood in place and did not move. Everyone knew that although Lu Qin was despicable, and although his words were so straightforward and hurtful, his words were not wrong. Amidst the cold silence, a man slowly walked out from an inconspicuous corner behind the crowd. He looked at the man and woman standing in the center of the field from afar. Was he? Lu Chen's words just now seemed to echo in his heart and mind, reminding him that he had once been in the same awkward situation as Blood Warbler today. He was clearly only one step away, and if that high and mighty lord agreed to take him in as a disciple, then everything would be different. At that moment he suddenly felt that he was very similar to Blood Warbler. They had both done their utmost to serve True Lord Tianlan, and they had both risked their lives for him. They were both so outstanding that most people recognized them, and they were only one step away from the peak in their hearts. Just that one step was like the difference between heaven and earth. He Yi's gaze was a little dark and uncertain. He let out a soft sigh and seemed to have thought of something. The corners of his mouth slightly curled up, as if he was secretly happy and pleased with his choice. In front of the house, Blood Warbler naturally did not know that there was a person called He Yi who actually appreciated her in his heart. Of course, even if she knew, she would not feel any gratitude towards him. It was more likely that she would snort disdainfully. She was a proud woman. In order to prove her excellence, she had worked very hard all these years. She had done her best, and the results were also pretty much the best, except for the fact that she had not been able to catch that hateful elder ghost. Also, except for the Lord whom she had followed loyally for many years. Although he had given her power, fame, and a position that everyone admired, he had never taken her in as his disciple. She had once thought that everything would come naturally, and that this was just a test from the Lord, true Lord. Or perhaps there was something that she had not done well enough. After all, a godlike figure like true Lord Tianlan had such a vast and magnificent foundation. If she wanted to become his successor, she would definitely have to be even more outstanding. That was why Blood Warbler had never complained. She had only worked hard to make herself more outstanding so that she could build his empire for him. Until one day a person called Lu Chen appeared and became his disciple. And now, this Lu Chen, who had snatched away all of her hopes, had coldly asked her this question in front of her. Do you have the qualifications? This was the sharpest knife that Blood Warbler had ever heard or seen in her life. When it pierced into her chest, that kind of pain felt as if all the decades of suppression had been triggered in an instant, and then exploded out, wanting to tear her entire body apart, throwing everything that she had once treasured onto the ground and trampling on it. It made her wish she was dead and made her wish she was dead. It turned out that all these years had been for naught. Her face was deathly pale, and her lips were trembling slightly. She stared fixedly at Lu Chen. If looks could kill, then Lu Chen would definitely have died 100 times. Unfortunately, he could not. She slowly raised her hand and pointed at Lu Chen. Word by word, it was as if all the anger in her body was gathered in that one word. You actually dare like this? Even now Lu Chen still had no intention of backing down. He looked coldly at this extremely angry woman and said, "Today's matter is not your chance. Don't even think of using this against me or my people." After saying this, he turned and walked down the stone steps. Under everyone's gaze, he walked all the way to the side of Old Ma and Black Dog. Then, he swept his gaze across the faces of the people surrounding him. His gaze was a little cold and there was a hint of provocation in it. However, the people opposite him all avoided his gaze. After a moment of stalemate, they slowly retreated into the darkness. Standing in front of the house, Blood Warbler's face became even paler. Atsu moved his head to Lu Chen's side and rubbed against his leg. Old Ma's expression was still solemn, but it could be seen that he was relieved. However, when he walked to Lu Chen's side, he hesitated for a moment and said in a low voice, "It's not worth it for you to shed all pretense of cordiality like this." Lu Chen did not look at him. He just turned around and said lightly, "After so many years, I only have you as my subordinate. Although you're useless, I can't just let you be harmed by others." Old Ma looked at him for a while, then nodded and smiled. Then he puffed out his chest and followed behind Lu Chen. Together with the majestic and grimacing Atsu, they once again walked towards the house. Blood Warbler was still standing there, but this time, Lu Chen did not even look at her. He just walked past her and strode into the house that was filled with the thick smell of blood. Only Blood Warbler was left. Under the strange gazes of the crowd, she stood alone at the door. Chapter 581. Lu Chen and Shuiying actually did not make a move until the very end. At the end of the day, the two of them were just using their mouths and not their fists. They could still leave some leeway if they argued and ridiculed each other too much, but if they really fought without caring about anything else, the situation would be completely out of control. The two of them would no longer have a way out. It could even be said that if they fought, they would not leave any leeway for Supreme Lord Tianlan, who had yet to show himself. If it really came to that, Supreme Lord Tianlan could only choose between the two of them and completely give up on the other. The word, give up, here basically meant that one would never be able to make a comeback. To put it simply, it was probably the word, death. Lu Chen was a smart person. He could acutely sense that Shuiying seemed to be intentionally using this sudden incident to attack the prestige and influence of his side. Although it was obscure, there was a hint of sharpness in it. Therefore, he made a judgment in an instant and directly exposed the conflict between the two of them in an attempt to provoke Shuiying. Shuiying was also a smart person. She had been arrogant for so many years in power. Apart from the few divine transformation true lords in Zhangxianming, when had she ever lowered her head to anyone? But this time she actually managed to forcefully endure it until the very end. In the end, the two of them did not cross that line. The footsteps gradually faded away. It seemed like Lu Chen had already brought Old Ma and Atsu into the house. However, Shuiying was still standing at the main entrance. It had been many years since anyone had dared to reprimand and ridicule her like this. This was quite a loss of face. She looked around and swept her gaze across those people. At this time even more people had gathered. Most of them were from Fiyunji, while some were from Supreme Lord Tianlan's faction. For example, there were also quite a few from the Kunlun party. They could all be considered as her own people. However, the more people there were, the more intense the burning sensation on his face seemed to be. Other than that, so many people had seen this scene. Although no one dared to look her in the eye at this moment, and most people looked away or lowered their eyes when her eyes swept across, Shuang knew clearly that as long as the sun rose, the entire Celestial Dragon Mountain, the entire Zhangxianming, would probably know what had happened here tonight. It was impossible to keep this information a secret. Someone would definitely leak it out, and it was very likely that more than one person would. There were no secrets in Zhangxianming. She suddenly felt a little tired and also a little lost. When she swept her gaze across the crowd just now, she clearly saw that in the eyes of these Fiyunji subordinates who were usually loyal to her, there were shock, doubt, anger, sympathy, and all sorts of other emotions. However, there was only one thing that she had secretly hoped for in the depths of her heart. Yes, these elite troops who would normally risk their lives because of a word or order from her, in tonight's conflict, almost all of them had unanimously chosen to stay out of it. Not a single person stood up for her, shouted for her, or attacked her in anger because of her humiliation. Perhaps if something like that really happened, she would berate and stop them, but she did not. From that moment on, Shuang understood one thing. Even though she had worked hard for so many years, even though she had given everything she had to Fiyunji, Fiyunji did not belong to her. Fiyunji would forever belong to the high and mighty true Lord Tianlan. Because of this, when she and Lu Qin had a fierce conflict, although she was still the leader of Fiyunji, no one in Fiyunji stood up to support her. Everyone watched from the sidelines because they knew that what Lu Qin had said was not wrong. Lu Qin had the status of master and disciple, but Shuang did not. Indeed, Shuang did not have the right to call him that. In other words, everyone present was a smart person. No one would have guessed that after true Lord Tianlan passed away, there would only be one person who would inherit this magnificent foundation. No one stood up to support her. In that instant, Shuang felt as if all the strength in her body had been sucked out. She silently looked up at the sky. The night was dark and a trace of pain flashed through her eyes. Why was this? Decades of kindness and loyalty still could not be exchanged for that person's pity? In what way could she not compare to Lu Qin? People said that true Lord Tianlan was omnipotent and omniscient. If this was true, then why hadn't he shown up until now? Was he trying to make something clear or hint at something? Shuang slowly turned around and walked into the house with some difficulty. It was hard to imagine that not long ago she was still in high spirits and full of ambition, ready to show off her skills. But now she seemed to have suddenly fallen into a predicament. Had she underestimated Lu Qin, or had she misjudged Tianlan? Behind the crowd, he stared at the beautiful woman in front of the gate and frowned slightly. A trace of sympathy seemed to flash through his eyes. He then shook his head gently, sighed and looked away. This night seemed to be especially long. Even now it was still dark and there was no sign of dawn. The smell of blood kept drifting from the front, nauseating and disgusting. Lu Qin and old Ma both frowned. The two of them were not good people and they had seen some very tragic things. But no matter what, this kind of thing was never pleasant. It was very peaceful along the way. The people of Fiyunji had already completely controlled this place, but almost no one spoke. Only the faint cries of pain in the distance seemed to emit a desolate atmosphere. The road, the walls, and even the flower corridors and other places were very clean. The Azura Hell, the scene of mountains of corpses and seas of blood, had not appeared yet. But this did not make Lu Qin and old Ma feel any more relaxed. There was no one on the road, but the atmosphere was still so strong. Then, the situation in the place where something really happened could be imagined. Seeing that there was no one nearby, old Ma suddenly walked 2 steps faster and came to Lu Qin's side, walking side by side. Lu Qin turned his head and glanced at him with a gloomy face. Old Ma stared at him. After a while, he finally could not help but grab his hand. The two of them stopped and stood still. Old Ma lowered his voice and said bitterly, "This has nothing to do with you, right?" Lu Qin looked at him silently and said after a moment, "Do you think it is possible for me to do such a thing?" Old Ma gritted his teeth and said, "I believe you did not do it, but we both know in our hearts that as long as you harden your heart, maybe you will do it." Lu Qin snorted and said, "I just did it to save you. Don't you know that?" "I know." Old Ma said flatly, "I am very grateful and gratified, but I want you to tell me that you did not do it for revenge." Lu Qin looked at him quietly. After a while, he nodded and said calmly, "I did not do it." Old Ma suddenly felt relieved and let out a long sigh. Then he smiled bitterly and said, "That's good, that's good. It's not far ahead, let's go and have a look." As he said, his face looked a bit bitter and sympathetic. He whispered, "Listening to that voice, Qin, he seems to be going crazy. I don't know what happened." Lu Qin glanced at him and said nothing. He just walked forward. In the smell of blood, they walked to the bedroom in the backyard. Then they saw Qin He, who had just greeted them with a smile outside the Tingyu building not long ago. That man fell to the ground in the courtyard and looked in the direction of a bedroom. His whole body was twitching and trembling, crying and wailing as if he had suddenly broken down. Standing around the courtyard were a dozen or so members of the Floating Clouds Agency. Every single one of them had an ugly expression on their faces. Lu Qin and Old Ma's eyes immediately fell on the bedroom door that was half closed. At the same time, footsteps sounded again. It was Shuiying with a cold face who had also come here. They looked at the bedroom together. Then they could sense a strong smell of blood surging out from it. Lu Qin stood where he was for a moment and then walked over. Under everyone's gaze, he slowly walked to the door of the bedroom alone. Then he gently pushed open the half-closed door and glanced into the room. Old Ma looked at him from behind and could vaguely feel that at that moment, Lu Chen's body seemed to stiffen. After a while, Lu Chen slowly took 2 steps back and turned around. This time his gaze fell on Qin He, who was lying on the ground. Everyone in the courtyard, including Shuiying, looked at him with a somewhat complicated expression. But Lu Chen turned a blind eye to these gazes from the outside. He walked to Qin He's side. Qin He seemed to have no feelings for him at all and was only wailing with a hoarse voice. Lu Chen stretched out his palm and patted his shoulder. After a while he said, "First, restrain your grief and accept your fate." After a while, he opened his mouth again and said, "This matter will not end like this. We will definitely give you an explanation." When he said this last sentence, his voice was a little louder. Almost everyone in the courtyard heard it. Chapter 582. In the end, the bedroom in that house was tightly sealed by the people of Fiyunji. Only a few people went in and saw what happened inside, but the truth of what happened inside was quickly spread. In this regard, Fiyunji did not strictly control the situation. One reason was that there were too many people present, and it was indeed difficult to completely prevent the news from leaking. The other reason was that at this point, if they kept suppressing the news, it would instead make it seem strange. In fact, even if they did not get close to the bedroom with the strong smell of blood and did not see what was happening inside, as long as they saw the owner of the house, Qin He, scream and howl after entering the house, and then fall to the ground in pain as if he had gone mad, they could more or less guess the truth. That was the master's bedroom, not a place to keep animals, and it was impossible for pigs and sheep to be slaughtered in there. It was almost self-evident what such a strong smell of blood meant. Looking at Qin He's reaction, the truth was almost on the verge of being revealed. But why did he do this? This was the question in the hearts of most people, and on this night, another dispute suddenly occurred between the 2 powerful figures of true Lord Tianlan's faction, Lu Qin and Shuiying, which also somewhat lessened the horrifying and sorrowful atmosphere. After the incident, the reason for the dispute between these 2 people was also spread. Although the source of the rumor could not be found, the rumor was very clear. In this dispute, Lu Qin was the one who tore all pretenses of cordiality, but it seemed that the cause of the matter was first provoked by Shuiying. Shuiying seemed to have grown suspicious of Lu Qin and his closest subordinate, Old Ma. She did not dare to directly touch Lu Qin, but wanted to detain Old Ma in an attempt to do something. In the end, Lu Qin turned hostile on the spot and fought back forcefully, even directly mocking Shuiying's identity and status. In a short period of time, he directly tore apart the coat of harmony between the 2 of them, revealing the true situation of the 2 of them being as incompatible as fire and water. This was what it meant to suddenly stop playing and flip the table in anger. To be honest, many people did not understand why Lu Qin did this, including a large number of other forces in Zhangxianmeng and a large number of people in Fiyunji. However, what was strange was that perfected Lord Tianlan, who had supreme power and prestige in Fiyunji, did not show up until the end of the night. Qin He, who surrendered to Zhangxianmeng, abandoned the dark side of the evil cult for the light and then turned against them, was once a tough man who could not be subdued by force or corrupted by wealth. Faced with Zhangxianmeng's terrifying means in Fiyunji, he could still withstand it and did not betray the evil cult and elder ghost. Until the end, Lu Qin used the strategy of attacking his heart and sowing discord, threatening him with the lives of Chen He's family, and letting Chen He know that the evil cult had given up on him and regarded him as an enemy. Only then did Chen He painfully abandon his past and pledge loyalty to the righteous. However, all of this now seemed to have become a farce and a joke, full of sarcasm and ridicule. Chen He had once disregarded everything for the safety of his family, and would rather betray the first half of his life. But now, right under his eyes, on the so-called safest place in the world, on Mount Celestial Dragon, where the headquarters of Zhang Xianming was located, all of his family, wife, and children were forever left in that dark bedroom, never to come out again. It was said that their deaths were very, very tragic, with a lot of blood flowing. This was also the reason why the smell of blood was unusually strong that night. After Chen He saw that scene, he collapsed, but he did not completely go crazy. After crying in pain for a night, this man gradually woke up the next day and ran directly to the outside of the majestic Kunlun main hall. Just like that, he knelt straight on the stone steps in front of the main hall. Without saying a word, he knelt on the ground and then knelt like that for a day and a night. During this time, many people came to persuade him, Shuang, Lu Qin, those acquaintances from Fiyunji and so on. They all came to persuade him to take care of his body, and that revenge had to be planned in the long run. But Chen He just did not listen and just knelt on the ground stiffly. His face was very pale and there was almost no blood. Anyone could see that this man at this moment was just holding on with his last breath. If there was even the slightest movement, he would not be able to bear it. So no matter who it was at this moment, no one dared to act recklessly. Of course, there might be some people who looked sad on the surface and advised him, but in their hearts they were happy. No one could persuade Chen He to leave. In addition, this matter had gradually spread. After sending people to persuade him several times to no avail, Supreme Tianlan finally had no choice but to appear outside the main hall and appease Chen He in a pleasant manner. Chen He did not have any other request and only said 2 words, "Revenge." Supreme Tianlan agreed. But in Zhang Xianming after that day, there was a kind of dark and unclear criticism secretly spreading. It was said that the high and mighty bald Supreme Tianlan did not immediately agree to this natural request, but hesitated. After a while he reluctantly agreed. Why was this? There must be a reason for this abnormality. Almost all the other forces in Zhang Xianming paid attention to this point. On the contrary, no one actually paid attention to Supreme Jianghu of Heaven's Law Hall, who was the first to make a fuss that night. Supreme Jianghu was an old and powerful supreme, and Heaven's Law Hall was indeed a great hall with a long history. But now, it was the era of Supreme Tianlan and Fiyunji. Why does the old man Tianlan have concerns? Could it be that there are other secrets in this matter that we don't know? In the main hall of Heaven's Law Hall, when only Supreme Jianghu and Song Wenji were left, Song Wenji saw that there was no one around and asked Supreme Jianghu this question in her heart. Supreme Jianghu frowned slightly and seemed to have thought about this for a long time. In the end, he said in a low voice, "Now it seems that it is not that the unfound murderer is difficult to deal with, but that he has some concerns about the dispute between his 2 subordinates." Song Wenji's eyes flashed slightly and she raised her eyebrows, saying, "Lu Qin and Shuang?" True Lord Jianghu nodded his head. With his hands clasped behind his back, he walked 2 steps around the main hall and said, "I heard that Shuang had wanted to detain Lu Chen's most trusted subordinate that night." Unexpectedly, it triggered a strong reaction from Lu Chen, causing him to shed all pretenses of cordiality. At that time, I was thinking that there seemed to be something wrong with the reaction of that young man named Lu Chen. Song Wenji replied with a and said, "Yes, before this, he has been tolerating to get along with Shuang. This is also a prudent way to preserve the past. After all, he is the only disciple of Supreme Tianlan. In the future, as long as there are no accidents, this foundation will naturally be inherited by him. There is no benefit in having a conflict with Shuang now." Supreme Jianghu glanced at her and said, "Exactly, this is the way of a smart person. First endure and wait for the right time and then plan for the long term." But that Lu Chen just had to put aside the past and insist on falling out with Shuang. In my opinion, the problem lies in Shuang suddenly detaining his subordinate. Song Wenji said, "Is there a problem with his subordinate?" Supreme Jianghu thought for a while and slowly shook his head, saying, "Shuang did this, perhaps, to take the opportunity to create trouble, and put the name of the murderer on Lu Chen's head. After all, Supreme Tianlan is still alive, and it is not impossible for him to replace his disciple in the future." Song Wenji slowly nodded and did not speak, but a strange light flashed in the depths of her eyes. At this moment, Supreme Jianghu sneered as if he was somewhat disdainful of this matter, and was unwilling to say more. He changed the topic to Song Wenji and said, That person has done a good job. Make the arrangements, I will come and see him in a few days. Song Wenji was shocked and said, Godfather, you have already completely trusted him? Supreme Tiehu laughed and stroked his white beard and said, This time the effect of the proof of allegiance is better than I expected. Enough. He slightly narrowed his eyes and said, One day I will let that baldy suffer. Chapter 583. Perfected Lord Tianlan asked Lu Qin to come over. After dismissing his attendants, they were the only ones left in the huge Kunlun Hall. What was different from the past was that Perfected Lord Tianlan even asked someone to close the door of the hall this time. When the heavy door was closed, it cut off all the noises outside and the prying eyes in the dark. Only the master and disciple were left. It seemed that the matter this time was very serious. True Lord Tianlan seemed to be very angry. Otherwise he wouldn't have mocked Lu Chen with sarcastic words like, You've grown wings, after he arrived. Then when he dismissed the others, his voice was like thunder, striking fear in people's hearts. Lu Chen didn't argue in front of everyone. Perhaps facing such a famous and powerful perfected Lord Master, anyone would feel great pressure. After all, a word from perfected Lord Tianlan could make countless people bleed. When everyone left and the magnificent hall quieted down, Lu Chen slowly raised his head and looked forward. He saw the bald perfected lord's anger fade away. He frowned slightly and sat down casually on the ground in front of him. Dressed in a loose robe, he looked like a deity or Buddha. Perfected Lord Tianlan glanced at Lu Chen and waved his hand. Come here. Lu Chen walked over quietly and sat down in front of him. Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and asked, Did you do it? Lu Chen shook his head decisively and said firmly, No. Perfected Lord Tianlan stared at him for a moment and his expression softened a little, but he still looked angry. He said, Okay, then tell me, if you were the leader of Fiyunji and encountered such a thing, who do you think would have the most motive to kill Qin He's wife and children? Lu Chen frowned and looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan. He didn't speak immediately. Perfected Lord Tianlan said lightly, Just say what I want you to say. Wasn't it always like this in the past? Or is it that now that you've officially become my disciple, you're feeling apprehensive and don't dare to speak your mind? Lu Chen was silent for a moment before he gently exhaled and nodded. All right. Perfected Lord Tianlan grinned. His expression seemed to have become much gentler, causing the quiet surroundings of the hall to no longer be so stiff and cold. He asked again in a calm voice, Then tell me, if we don't talk about the evidence and only talk about the evidence, who is the most suspicious? Oma, Lu Chen said. The hall seemed to fall silent for a moment. Even with Perfected Lord Tianlan's experience, he could not help but cast a sidelong glance at Lu Chen. There was a scrutinizing look in his eyes. After a while he said, Ma Xiaoyun? You actually think it's him? Lu Chen's expression was calm as he said, Originally, he was eager to leave the Immortal City and use the mission of going to the Western continent to chase after the remnants of the devil cult to roam free for a while. Originally there was no problem, but later on you and Shuiying arranged for this matter to be handed over to Qin He. It's inevitable that he's dissatisfied. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded and said, That makes sense. But I guess you're going to say, But, next? But, Lu Chen said, It can't be him. Perfected Lord Tianlan asked, Why? Lu Chen said, When the incident happened he was with me the entire time. There was no time for him to commit murder. Besides, old Ma is not brave and his cultivation is shallow. He can't do such a violent and cruel thing. Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered, looking a little disapproving. However, he did not refute Lu Chen and only said, According to what you said, it's not him. Then who else is there to suspect? There are a few more. Lu Chen politely pointed at himself and said, According to Shuiying and Hall Master Shui's thoughts, I'm probably a very big suspect. This time, Perfected Lord Tianlan really laughed and looked at him with interest. After sizing him up, he nodded and said with a smile, I think so too. You're a ruthless and meticulous person. You're not on good terms with Shuiying, and Qin He abandoned you to rely on her. Also, Ma Xiaoyun is also your most trusted subordinate. Even if you did it to establish your own prestige, it seems very suspicious, not to mention for Ma Xiaoyun. You're right, but unfortunately it's not me. Lu Chen looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, If you still want to ask, I was with old Ma that night. I didn't have time to do this. Perfected Lord Tianlan was stunned for a moment, then laughed and sighed, You're getting more and more shameless. I'm just telling the truth. If I did it, I'll admit it. If I didn't do it, I didn't do it. Lu Qin said. Alright, I believe you. Perfected Lord Tianlan actually admitted this without hesitation and said, but you have to explain to me now. Why did you have to shed all pretense of cordiality with Shuang that night? Don't you know how difficult this is for me? Lu Qin wanted to say something but stopped. He looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said with some surprise, why aren't you asking about who the murderer is? Nonsense. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked a little annoyed and said with some contempt, who has the leisure to care about the life and death of a few irrelevant people? The death of Qin He's wife and child is nothing to me. Seriously, it's you and Shuang who are causing trouble for me. Don't be so long-winded and tell me clearly. Lu Qin fell silent. After a while he sighed and said, so that's what you think? It's a little scary just thinking about it. If I were to sit in your position in the future, would I become as cold-blooded and heartless as you? Yes. Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded with certainty and said, brat, you are already as cold-blooded and heartless as me. If you succeed in your cultivation in the future and achieve great things, you will definitely walk through mountains of corpses and seas of blood. Calling you cold-blooded and heartless is definitely not enough to describe you. Lu Qin's face darkened. He glared at Perfected Lord Tianlan and suddenly scolded, Scram, don't curse me. Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed out loud and seemed to be very happy. It was rare to see him so happy. He chuckled and said, are you angry? But you are angry. Is it because you still think that what I said is very likely to be right? It's just that you can't stand it? Lu Qin took a deep breath and no longer paid attention to this damned Baldy's provocation. After calming himself down, he told Perfected Lord Tianlan about his quarrel with Shuang that night. In the end he said, Shuang was clearly dissatisfied with my sudden rise in power and wanted to make use of the opportunity to make me lose face. If she could use some methods to make old Ma confess under torture, if she couldn't, your decision to make me your successor would be shaken. Perfected Lord Tianlan frowned and said, so you fell out with her on the spot? Lu Qin said, yes. Perfected Lord Tianlan sneered and said, are you so sure that I will definitely protect you? Shuang has the entire Fiyunji behind her and she is also loyal to me. Why should I? Lu Qin thought about it and said, I think that Shuang herself is the third possible murderer. Perfected Lord Tianlan was taken aback and his expression changed slightly. He said, what do you mean? Lu Qin said, you just said that evidence doesn't matter. In that case, she has benefited the most from this incident and is naturally suspicious. He looked at Perfected Lord Tianlan and said, so? You know that what I said makes sense. Shuang deliberately framed me. This is something that she would do. As long as you let me investigate her, of course, you have to give me the authority and remove her from the position in Fiyunji. In less than 5 days I will definitely give you an explanation. No. Perfected Lord Tianlan suddenly interrupted him. Lu Qin was stunned and stopped talking. Perfected Lord Tianlan said slowly, in the future my foundation will be yours. But for now I won't allow you to touch her. Lu Qin stared at Perfected Lord Tianlan. After a while he asked, why? Why is it that for the past few decades, out of all the extraordinary people under you, she is the only one that you respect and trust? Chapter 584. Why couldn't he touch Shuang? There were probably many possible answers to this question. For example, most people could think that Shuang had followed Supreme Lord Tianlan for many years and had always been loyal to him. Or perhaps she had made great contributions and done countless things for Supreme Lord Tianlan. She had worked hard for him and built a solid foundation for his current foundation. Those who were quick-witted or had many schemes in their minds could probably think that perhaps after so many years, as Supreme Lord Tianlan's most capable subordinate, Shuang was in charge of such a powerful and terrifying force like Fiyunji. Fiyunji had always been famous for its shadows. No one knew how many secrets Shuang knew or was hiding. Among these secrets, were there any secrets related to Supreme Lord Tianlan's dark side? Could there be something that she could use against him? These guesses were mostly in line with everyone's thoughts. However, whether or not they were the truth, Lu Qin didn't know. Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't tell him and he didn't ask. After Supreme Lord Tianlan clearly told him not to touch Shuang, he didn't say a word about this matter. However, at this point there didn't seem to be anything else to say. Supreme Lord Tianlan knew what he wanted to know and Lu Qin also understood Supreme Lord Tianlan's attitude. The two of them each took what they needed. Therefore not long after Lu Qin stood up and bid farewell, leaving the grand hall of Kunlun. When he left, he even brought the door of the hall with him. Therefore, after a moment of light shone in, the hall returned to its somewhat gloomy and dim state. The only difference was that instead of the two people just now, Supreme Lord Tianlan's figure was now alone. He indeed seemed to have a somewhat lonely aura. Supreme Lord Tianlan stared in the direction of the door. After a while, he suddenly sighed softly. His sigh sounded a little melancholy. It wasn't loud, but it was exceptionally clear in this quiet hall. It was also at this moment that another voice suddenly rang out in this hall. It was deep and rich, like thunder rolling slowly in the dark clouds. Your disciple is very good. Why are you sighing? Supreme Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change, as if he was not surprised by the sudden appearance of this voice. However, he frowned slightly at its words and said, "It's rare that you would actually praise a mortal like him." As he spoke, Supreme Lord Tianlan reached into his bosom and took out a shining golden seal. It was the Kunlun seal that he had given to Lu Chen to go to the western continent. The golden radiance of the Kunlun seal gradually brightened, emitting dazzling rays of light. Not long after, a screen of light was formed in front of true Lord Tianlan, reflecting his face with a hint of gold. Needless to say, his big bald head was even reflecting some golden light. Amidst the solemnity and majesty, he revealed a rare comical look. Of course, there were no outsiders here to see this scene. However, even if someone did see this scene, probably no one would dare to make fun of this person. The screen of light condensed in midair like a wall of water. It undulated and then gradually calmed down. In the end, when the golden light quieted down, a black shadow appeared behind the light. Its appearance was blurry, but from the voice and the general outline of the shadow, it should be the black dragon that Lu Chen had seen in the depths of the sky and clouds in the forbidden area of Kunlun. Although the dragon behind the shadow seemed to be just an illusion, its disdainful aura seemed to be able to pass through the screen of light. When facing Supreme Lord Tianlan, it more or less restrained itself, but it still seemed to be a little condescending. It said indifferently, "That person is not bad. He's very much like you when you were young." Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head and stared at the black dragon. After a moment of silence, he said, "You're right." The black dragon shook its huge head as if it was stretching its body. At the same time, it said to Supreme Lord Tianlan, "But he actually left just like that. I thought that at this point he would make you support him even more openly." Supreme Lord Tianlan smiled and said, "He won't. Lu Chen is a smart person. Previously he said a lot of things to me, including his argument with Xueying, but it was all nonsense. He had already obtained what he wanted to hear the most. That's why he left so decisively and didn't care about Xueying at all." "What is it?" the black dragon asked. Supreme Lord Tianlan said, "He wanted me to clearly tell him that this foundation will be passed on to him in the future." The black dragon snorted and seemed to be somewhat disdainful. "That's what you said, but did he dare to believe it?" It looked down at perfected Lord Tianlan and said with a hint of mockery, "I'm sure he doesn't know what you've done in the past. It's not that hard for you to go back on your word." Supreme Lord Tianlan didn't get angry at the black dragon's sharp words, nor did he try to deny it. He only pondered for a moment, then said, "He believes me." The black dragon laughed as if it had heard something funny. "Looks like this young man is as stupid as me. He's the second person in the world who dares to trust you so much." Supreme Lord Tianlan glanced at the black dragon and smiled. "Although you haven't lived a good life these years, even you can't deny that I've done what I promised you back then, right?" The black dragon sneered and looked a little mocking, but he didn't deny it. "Others might not know, but I know how you got your current position." "What? Don't tell me that you can say with a clear conscience that you'll completely keep your promise to that young man." Supreme Lord Tianlan fell silent. The mockery in the black dragon's eyes intensified. It shook its body and the golden light on the Kunlun seal shook for a moment, then gradually retracted. Its huge figure gradually became blurry, but its voice still came through the screen of light. "You don't have to pretend in front of me. That young man will just be another sacrifice for you in the future." As the deep voice gradually faded, the golden light disappeared completely and the Kunlun seal returned to normal, falling back into Supreme Lord Tianlan's hand. Supreme Lord Tianlan clenched and relaxed his hand, putting the seal back into his pocket. He sat on the spot for a while longer, then silently stood up, walked to the door of the hall and opened it. A gust of wind blew in from outside the hall. Supreme Lord Tianlan narrowed his eyes. He stood in the wind, his sleeves fluttering. After a long time he suddenly smiled. There was a hint of profoundness and vicissitudes in his smile, as well as a hint of carefreeness and arrogance. With his hands behind his back, he looked at the world and said, "So what if I kept my promise to him?" Boom! Suddenly there was a rumble in the sky. It seemed to be echoing in the sky, but it also seemed like the heavens were responding to his words. Surprised, Supreme Lord Tianlan raised his head to look. At the same time, the mortals in the world looked up and saw a sudden change in the sky. Rays of light crisscrossed, and not long after, a sea of blood came crashing down, covering the sky and covering the earth. Moreover, this time, it seemed to have pushed over at least 80% of the sky. The rare phenomenon of the Crimson Sea appeared once again. Chapter 585. The phenomenon of a sea of blood that suddenly appeared enveloped the sky above Mount Heavenly Dragon and even the entire enormous city once more. Moreover, it was even more ferocious this time, and it blotted out the sun, leaving behind less than 20% of the sky that wasn't drowned by the sea of blood. And no matter how one looked at it, the last bit of space seemed to be swallowed by the blood sea at any time. This was the human world, the place where the human race had lived and multiplied for countless years. From ancient times to the present, people had long been familiar with the days of working at sunrise and resting at sunset. They were also familiar with the world where the earth was beneath their feet and the sky above their heads. The sky could be sunny or hazy, windy or rainy, exposed to snow and ice, spring, summer, autumn, or winter. People had seen everything and were already used to it. However, no one had experienced and seen the blood sea hanging upside down in the sky. It looked like it would collapse and destroy the entire world at any time. No matter how one looked at it, it seemed to be the doomsday aura that only the devil hell had. Therefore, although nothing had happened for the time being, there were many people who were very disgusted by this blood sea phenomenon. The well-informed Fiyunji sent a report the next day. It clearly pointed out that after the appearance of the blood sea phenomenon, the number of people leaving the immortal city suddenly doubled. Of course, most of those who didn't want to stay in this strange place because of disgust, fear, or simply because they didn't want to stay in this strange place were rogue cultivators and mortals outside the true immortal alliance. In Zhengxianmeng, which occupied this prosperous city and had unparalleled strength, there was no such phenomenon of people fleeing. Most people stayed here. The rules in the huge immortal alliance were strict. It was a serious crime to leave rashly. At this special time, it was more likely that they would be charged with the crime of shaking people's hearts. If that happened, they would suffer in the future. Of course, there were people who left the immortal city in the immortal alliance. In fact, there were quite a number of them. However, everyone said that those who left had all kinds of special tasks. They were leaving the immortal city to do something outside the city and not fleeing. Although there were many women and children among the people who left, there were also some familiar people. Anyway, those who were really powerful and had a way to leave, or at least let their families leave first, even if there were strict rules in the immortal alliance. This had been the case since ancient times. Lu Qin and Old Ma stood in a secluded place at the top of Mount Celestial Dragon. They looked up at the surging sea of blood in the sky. As the strong wind blew in the sky, the blood-colored clouds rose and fell, looking like the rolling waves of the sea. It was a very spectacular scene, but it carried a dark red aura, which made people's hair stand on end. They were afraid that the endless sea of blood would fall on their heads in the next moment. Old Ma gasped as he looked at the scene and said, "What the hell is this? It's actually so terrifying. I'm afraid that even the evil devil cult didn't create such a disgusting thing." Lu Qin didn't agree with him. Instead, he thought about it carefully for a while and shook his head at Old Ma. "That's not it." Old Ma was startled and said, "Why? Have you seen something more powerful and more terrible than this before?" Lu Qin nodded and said, "Yes, in the Battle of the Barren Valley, the devil cult Yun, Shou Yang and the other masters, including the southern barbarian fire shaman, opened a kind of god-subduing spell in the Barren Valley. At that time, the weather changed greatly, the sky broke, and there seemed to be evil gods descending in the violent wind and thunder. The scene at that time was much more terrible than it is now." Old Ma was a little surprised. He looked at Lu Qin with a somewhat complicated expression and said, "At that time I was on the periphery and didn't enter the Barren Valley, so this is the first time I've heard of this." "Well, for so many years, why haven't I heard you mention it?" Lu Qin looked at him and smiled. "Even the dead Baldy knows about this. Have you heard him mention it to others?" Old Ma immediately pursed his lips and shook his head without saying anything more. However, there was still an unconcealable doubt in his eyes. Obviously, he was puzzled by Lu Qin's sudden mention of this matter today. However, Luchin didn't seem to have any intention of clearing up his doubts. He glanced at the sky and said, "If I'm not wrong, this is probably just the beginning. More and more terrible things are yet to come." Old Ma rolled his eyes and said snappily, "You make it sound so easy." After a pause, he said gloomily, "I should have hidden in the Western continent and lived a carefree life. In the end, that errand was taken by Chen He. Now I can't go and he can't go either. Now he's staying at home all day looking like he's out of his wits. He looks quite pitiful." Luchin was silent for a moment and frowned slightly. It was unknown if he was thinking of the scene he saw at the door of the bedroom that night. Even with his heart of stone, a look of displeasure appeared on his face. After shaking his head slightly, he sighed and said, "Regardless of what kind of person Chen He is, his wife and child died unjustly. This matter is quite strange and treacherous. We have to investigate it carefully." Old Ma glanced at him and said, "So, that's why you made that promise to Chen He that day?" Luchin said lightly, "He should have trusted the dead Baldy more than me." After saying that, Luchin didn't seem to want to continue this topic. He changed the topic and said, "By the way, has White Lotus been looking for you recently? I feel like I haven't seen her for a while." Old Ma said, "No, I haven't seen her recently either. When I just came back a few days ago, I saw that she was in a bad mood. She was a little depressed. Since then, she has been locking herself in Su Qingjuan's house and rarely comes out." Luchin was slightly surprised and said, "This is rare. If it was in the past, she would have appeared long ago when such a big thing happened. Anyway, she has some friendship with us. Let's go and see her." Old Ma nodded and said, "Okay, she should still be living in Su Qingjuan's house. Let's go and see." After saying that, the two walked side by side in the direction of the house where Su Qingjun lived. Behind them, the blood clouds in the sky were rolling and the blood sea was surging. It seemed to be brewing to set off an even bigger wave. The blood sea phenomenon in the sky of the Immortal City was overwhelming, but there didn't seem to be much change in the Blood Moon City below the Immortal City. Even though the two looked very similar and were vaguely connected in countless ways, the Blood Moon City didn't seem to have changed much. What had changed in some details was that the mysterious aura that suppressed the cultivation of human cultivators in the Blood Moon City had become stronger recently. Ordinary cultivators who came here felt like they had entered hell. Their spiritual power was rolling in the opposite direction and it was very uncomfortable. So now, except for some necessary personnel, almost no one came to the Blood Moon City. Most of the time, it was empty, like an uninhabited ghost town. But in fact there was still life here. There were no plants, no animals, but there were two people. Under the dry well in the backyard of the mansion, White Lotus, who was tied up with a rope and unable to move, was pale and curled up into a ball. There was a trace of pain on her face. It seemed that she was suffering the suppression of the omnipresent power here. But other than that, for some reason, there seemed to be a trace of secret pleasure in the depths of her eyes. Because not far from her, on the other side of the dry well, there was a figure who was suffering 10 times or 100 times more. His body was lying on the ground, his hands tearing at his skin and flesh. The ground was dripping with blood. Chapter 586. After an unknown amount of time, the masked man in the dry well finally calmed down. The pain that wreaked havoc in his body seemed to have temporarily forgiven him, quietly hiding in a dark corner. The man's breathing stabilized and he stood up. After tidying up his clothes, he suddenly glanced at White Lotus. The mask was hideous and terrifying, flashing a strange luster, but because of this, the expression on the man's face could not be seen. White Lotus's body shrank slightly, and her face revealed a somewhat fearful expression. As for the little bit of joy in her eyes, it immediately disappeared after the masked man calmed down. Now she was in a corner of the dry well, her body pressed against the stone wall, and her whole body curled up into a ball. She really looked like a young girl, ignorant and pure, and when she saw the strange man in front of her, she seemed to be very afraid. After a while, even the last bit of panting disappeared. The masked man seemed to let out a long breath, and then raised his eyes to look above. Bai Lian followed his gaze and looked in the same direction. She only saw the round hole above the well. There was nothing there except for the round blood-red sky. "Who are you?" the masked man asked White Lotus in a low and somewhat hoarse voice. White Lotus shrank her body and then replied timidly, "I just told you my name is White Lotus, and I am a disciple of the Kunlun party." During the gap between the masked man's words, White Lotus's eyebrows drooped, and she looked very afraid, just like an ignorant girl. But in fact, the corner of her eyes still quietly glanced in that direction, and at the same time her mind was racing, trying to guess the identity of this person. This was an underground cave in a mysterious city. There was a blood moon anomaly above it, and the floating clouds office and the star hall were heavily guarded outside. It was obvious that this was a great secret. Ordinary people would not even know the specific details of the truth, let alone enter. White Lotus herself did not know the secret below, so she was curious and secretly followed Lu Qin, Oxen and Black Dog to sneak here. At this time she more or less came to a realization. No wonder Lu Qin, Fiunji and Shuang did so many things and searched so hard and almost turned the immortal city upside down, but still could not find the whereabouts of Elder Ghost. If this person in front of her was indeed Elder Ghost, it would explain why Fiunji returned without any results. Probably no one would have thought that Elder Ghost would actually be hiding under everyone's noses. However, looking at this person's appearance, especially the painful and even self-mutilating action just now, White Lotus had an idea in her heart. This Elder Ghost did not have an extremely terrifying hidden illness, or he was seriously affected by this underground world that was shrouded by the blood moon radiance. It was even possible that it was both. Elder Ghost seemed to have completely calmed down at this moment. Of course, the mask on his face covered his face, and it was impossible to see whether he was happy or sad. Only a pair of deep light could be seen in his eyes. He looked at White Lotus and after a moment of silence he said, "Just an ordinary Kunlun disciple?" White Lotus did not speak, but her heart still slightly tightened. After a moment she heard Elder Ghost say, "Why would an ordinary Kunlun disciple come here? There are many people guarding outside this cave, right? Also, when you were caught by me, that Taoist technique divine power, was it called Snow Wind Scripture? That thing is not ordinary." White Lotus almost instantly made a decision in her heart, and then said, "I am a disciple of the Kunlun party. My master's Taoist name is Bai Chen, and he was the one who taught me the Snow Wind Scripture. However, he has already passed away, and I have no one to rely on in this immortal city. As for why I came here, it's because I was too bored, so I followed that person named Lu Qin down here to have some fun. Senior, I really didn't mean to disturb you. Please spare me this time, please?" At the end of her sentence, tears welled up in White Lotus's eyes, and she actually looked like she was really about to cry. However, in her heart, her thoughts were spinning rapidly, and she was thinking hard of a countermeasure. Although she was begging bitterly, but in reality White Lotus's thoughts were very clear in her heart. It was fine if this person was not Elder Ghost, but if he really was Elder Ghost, then it was impossible for him to let her go. What if he let her go and snitched on her? Putting her life in the hands of a seemingly innocent and strange young girl? White Lotus herself did not believe this kind of thing, so she also did not believe that this devil sect's last great enemy, who had a terrible reputation and had been the enemy of the righteous faction Zhengxianmeng for decades, would make this mistake. Yes, from White Lotus's point of view, the possibility of this monster that was neither human nor ghost being shameless and obscene, or even killing her, was far higher than the possibility of him being kind. Then right now it was a hopeless situation where she had a slim chance of survival. She seemed to be unable to defeat this person. Then was there still a chance of survival? Hearing White Lotus's pleading, Elder Ghost looked as expected indifferent, and did not even hesitate at this moment, but coldly looked at White Lotus and said, "Snow Wind Scripture is indeed a good thing. Your teacher actually passed it down to you. Seems like he values your talent very highly." White Lotus said, "Yes, to tell the truth to Senior, teacher only passed down the Snow Wind Scripture to me alone. My other two senior brothers did not obtain this skill." When Elder Ghost heard till here for the first time, he revealed a little astonishment, and then after a moment of silence, he looked at White Lotus, his voice awe-inspiring, and said, "Didn't expect you to be such a lucky person. That Snow Wind Scripture is a unique skill. Senior, you want it? I will pass it to you." White Lotus directly interrupted, her tone firm, her expression sincere, as if the person in front of her was not her enemy, but her great benefactor who had given her a second life. Elder Ghost paused for a moment, probably did not expect that the little girl in front of him would actually have this kind of attitude. The Snow Wind Scripture, in the eyes of a person at his level, was of course an extremely precious treasure. As long as there was a chance, he would definitely want to take it for himself. But White Lotus's reaction was far from what he had originally expected. For a moment he did not know what to say, and only after a long while did he say, "Isn't this your teacher's painstaking effort? You are the disciple of a Huashan true monarch. Why don't you have the slightest thought of being loyal to him?" A trace of sadness flashed across White Lotus's face and then said, I have let Senior see a joke. To tell the truth, ever since teacher passed away, I have been bullied and humiliated in the Kunlun party, especially my martial uncle Tianlan. He was even cold-hearted towards me. As she said till here, she secretly glanced at Elder Ghost from the corner of her eye, and indeed saw that when Elder Ghost heard the name of true monarch Tianlan, his body slightly shook as if his attention was suddenly focused. White Lotus laughed coldly in her heart. For so many years being crushed and hunted down by true monarch Tianlan, in terms of the person who had the greatest resentment towards true monarch Tianlan, there was probably no one in the world who could be more resentful towards true monarch Tianlan than this Elder Ghost. Whether there was a chance of survival would depend on how deep this Elder Ghost's hatred towards true monarch Tianlan was. Chapter 587. It had been a few days since the murder of women and children happened on Mount Sky Dragon. This incident had a great impact. It was said that even a few demigod true monarchs were paying attention to it. After all, this incident happened on Mount Sky Dragon, in the heart of Zhengxianmeng. To some extent, it was equivalent to slapping the faces of all the people in Zhengxianmeng. Fortunately, the devil cult had basically been defeated, and it was difficult for them to stir up trouble again. In this bloody incident, no one found any clues related to the devil cult at the scene. Otherwise it would probably cause another uproar. 10 years ago, no, at most 5 years ago or even shorter, the only sect in the world that dared to do such a terrible thing to the core of the true Immortal Alliance's sphere of influence was the devil cult, the evil sect. And according to the usual practice, after the devil cult did such a thing, they must leave a trace to prove their identity. This was equivalent to announcing to Zhengxianmeng and even the whole world that this earth-shattering event was done by them. Therefore this time the scene was so clean. In fact, it also proved that the devil cult seemed to have nothing to do with this incident. This also made many people in Fuyunji heave a sigh of relief. After all, if one were to talk about the motive of the murder, the number one suspect who hated Qin He and his family to the bone would probably be the devil cult. As for those enemies in Zhengxianmeng because of the conflict of interests, it was unlikely that they would do such a thing. But now that the truth was in front of them, Qin He and his family were killed, Zhengxianmeng's face was completely lost, Fuyunji and even true monarch Tianlan's faces were slapped. So many people, including the various forces in Zhengxianmeng and the big and small forces in the big immortal city, paid special attention to the movements of Fuyunji during this period of time. Was there any movement in Fuyunji? Of course there was. After such a big event, if there was no movement, then wouldn't they be no different from a stone man? From Shuiying to the bottom of the Floating Clouds Division, the entire organization of the Floating Clouds Division seemed to have been mobilized. They started their investigation from the Heavenly Dragon Mountain and continued their pursuit. Their spies were everywhere, tracking down every single suspicious clue and suspicious person. As for whether or not this was of any use, outsiders had no idea. Everyone only knew that the terrifying murderer had yet to be caught. However, the Fuyun Agency's search efforts were getting stronger and stronger. The entire immortal city seemed to be restless because of them. It was just that the majority of people didn't dare to resist. After all, it was clear that the Fuyun Agency was truly anxious this time around. Regardless of whether it was the humiliation of being slapped in the face or the threat of the true monarch, who was at a higher level and had an awe-inspiring aura, they quickly turned into pressure on the people of the Floating Cloud Service. Regardless of whether that murderer was dead or alive, they had to find him. The whole immortal city was solemn. It seemed like even the prosperity of the past had lost its color. Perhaps under the pressure of such a strong force, the people had become cautious and cautious. Since he was very young, he was basically a very cautious person. His parents died when he was young, and he had a younger brother who was even more immature to take care of. Along the way he had really suffered a lot. When he was young it was to eat his fill. When he was older he entered the Kunlun party to climb up. Everything was for a better life so that he could be more at ease. Yes, he had never been at ease. In the depths of his heart, he always felt that he would always be the child who pulled his young and immature younger brother and stood helplessly and hopelessly on the streets. He had no sense of security. He had nothing. He always felt that everything in his hands could be lost at any time. Everything now was like a child's naive and exaggerated dream. When he woke up, everything was empty and he returned to that terrifying, lonely and hopeless world. He had never spoken of this feeling to anyone, including his younger brother, He Gang. Originally, everything seemed to be slowly getting better. He had become Dukan Jinren's disciple. His cultivation had advanced, his reputation had risen, and his future was limitless. Everything would get better. But later so many things happened one after another. his younger brother died and he didn't know who the real killer was. His master also died and the real killer was himself. Some paths had been taken wrongly, and it turned out that there was really no turning back. Every night, when it was dark and silent, when he was alone, he would think about the past, wondering if there was a second path he could choose. However, there was no medicine for regret in this world, even if it seemed that the choice he made was completely wrong. Perfected Lord Tianlan was not someone he could trust at all. Even though he had done so many things for this perfected Lord, betraying his master whom he was indebted to and betraying the first half of his life, he was perhaps as insignificant as an ant in perfected Lord Tianlan's eyes. He felt that he was about to lose everything. He was extremely afraid of this. Even if everyone in the world thought that he was strong and powerful, he knew that he was weak and timid inside. He could never let himself be in a situation where he had no one to rely on again. It was Tianlan who had betrayed him first. Everything he had done was just to let himself live better or even just to survive. He did not believe that after Lu Qin became the master, he would still tolerate him. After all, he had personally thrown him into the Longchuan River. He even felt that with true Lord Tianlan's ruthlessness, in order to pave the way for his disciple, he would probably die a violent death before Lu Qin became the master. This must never happen. Therefore, when the sea of blood hung in the sky, he passed through the underground passage and came to the small building again. He told himself again that everything he had done was not wrong. It was Lu Qin who was wrong, Tianlan who was wrong, and the whole world who was wrong. However, he could not forget the bloody scene that night. The cries and screams in the dark still seemed to echo in his ears. He shook his head and looked at the door that appeared in front of him in a daze. Then he pushed the door open and walked in. Just like the last time he came here, this door looked like a very warm and gentle bedroom, as if a young girl was living her best years here. The beautiful figure was sitting in front of the dressing table. Hearing the sound, she turned around and saw it was him. She immediately smiled sweetly, like a beautiful spring flower blooming. Farther behind her, on the bed, on the edge of the soft red quilt, sat another old man. He had white hair and snow-white eyebrows. Although some age spots could be seen on the exposed skin on his face and hands, he was still intimidating and awe-inspiring. Although he was not as high and mighty as true Lord Tianlan, he also had a kind of insufferably powerful aura. He's eyes lit up and he quickly stepped forward. He first cupped his fists, but after a moment of hesitation he suddenly knelt down on both knees and kowtowed in front of the old man. The old man raised his white eyebrows and smiled. He said, why do you do this? He lowered his head and said in a sincere tone, Disciple, he has been fascinated by Lord True Lord for a long time. Seeing you today I am even more convinced. All the things in the past were just because I didn't see a wise master. If Lord True Lord doesn't abandon me, disciple is willing to die for Lord True Lord. The old man laughed and said, You call me disciple the moment we meet. I don't remember having a master-disciple relationship with you. He's body trembled and his eyes turned sharply. Then he said with great joy, If I have the honor, he is willing to be Lord True Lord's disciple and I will die for you. The beautiful woman, Song Wenji, stood at the side and watched this scene. She smiled faintly, but a complicated expression flashed across the depths of her eyes. There was a tinge of coldness and a hint of mockery. She turned to look out of the window and saw that the sky was oppressive and the sea of blood was surging. She thought to herself that this filthy world would rather the end of the world come sooner. Chapter 588. Lu Qin and old Ma called outside the room where Su Qingjun used to live for a long time, but there was no movement in the room. The doors and windows were closed tightly. Looking at the situation, it was obvious that either the person in the room did not want to see them at all, or there was no one in the room at all. The two looked at each other, and their faces were a little ugly because this was not the first time they came to find White Lotus but did not get any results. From their conversation that day, they remembered that they had not seen White Lotus for a long time. This was the third time they came here, but every time they came the door was closed. If it happened once or twice, it could be said that it was a coincidence that White Lotus did not go out, but they did not see her 3 times in a row. Moreover, Lu Qin and old Ma were both careful people, and they had secretly inquired before. These days no one in Fuyunji had ever seen White Lotus. So, either White Lotus did not go out at all these days and locked herself inexplicably in the room as if she was meditating, or something happened that they did not know. Old Ma looked at Lu Qin and whispered, Something is wrong. Lu Qin nodded, and at the same time he also understood the meaning in old Ma's words that was not clear, but very obvious. After a moment of silence, he nodded and said, "Let's go in and have a look." The door was tightly shut and locked, but this was just an ordinary house. It was not the kind of immortal's cave that was protected by a powerful magic circle or a powerful mechanism. For the two of them who had been in the dark world for so many years, there was not much difference between having a barrier and not having a barrier. Old Ma nodded, walked over, stood in front of the door and used his body to block his hands. At the same time, Lu Qin walked behind him calmly and naturally, with his back to Old Ma, facing the road outside and glancing around. In order to meet White Lotus, they had purposely chosen a night when they were most likely to be at home. Therefore there was no one on the road outside. Old Ma stood still, and because his body was blocking the view, they couldn't see what he was doing. But after a while they heard a muffled sound, and then there was a clatter behind the door as if something had fallen to the ground. Old Ma breathed a sigh of relief and pushed the door with his hand. The door creaked open. A cool breeze blew past them. Lu Qin and Old Ma both frowned and walked in. The room was still a little dark, but everything was laid out before them, and looking round they had their answer. "There's no one in this house," Old Ma said in a deep voice. Lu Qin walked to the side of the table, touched the surface of the table, glanced at it and said lightly, "No one has cleaned here for a few days." Old Ma looked around and said, "The furniture is good and neatly arranged. No one has done anything here." Lu Qin nodded and after a moment of silence said, "She left here by herself and never came back." The two looked at each other and then fell silent. Because of the strange blood sea anomaly in the sky, the scenery in Immortal City and Mount Celestial Dragon had become very strange. During the day the light was blocked by the blood sea in the sky, so many places were very dark. But in the middle of the night, when everything was quiet and dark, many places were brighter than usual because of the strange dark red light emitted by the blood sea anomaly in the sky. Lu Qin and Old Ma walked on the road. The dark red light shone on them and even their faces seemed to be a little red. Usually at this time the road should be dark, but now they could see the surrounding scenery clearly. However, everything was smeared with a layer of red and it looked a little frightening. After walking for a while, Lu Qin suddenly said, "You go back first, I'll go to Kunlun Temple." Old Ma was shocked and his mind turned. After a moment, he frowned and said in a deep voice, "What do you want to do?" Lu Qin said, "White Lotus has a special identity. Although she is usually not favored by that damn Baldy, as long as Fiyunji and that damn Baldy don't fall, and she doesn't provoke those soul-severing old men, no one in Zhangxiaming will dare to touch her. The only one who has that idea." At this point, Lu Qin stopped and didn't continue, but Old Ma already understood what he meant and his frown deepened. He looked at Lu Qin and said, "What you said may be right, but what do you mean by going to Immortal like this? Do you want to question him for White Lotus?" He snorted and said, "Don't blame me for scolding you. I can't see that you have such deep feelings for her." Lu Qin was silent for a moment, but he shook his head and said, "You're wrong. I don't think it was done by that damn Baldy. It's just that she is the person chosen by that damn Baldy, so I must go and confirm with him. If even that damn Baldy doesn't know something happened to White Lotus, then this matter must be carefully investigated." Old Ma was stunned for a moment and then he nodded. It was true. White Lotus was the last disciple of Hakushin Jinkuan. Although she was not loved by the current immortal Tianlan because of the conflict between the factions in the sect, she was still his niece in name. Because of this, immortal Tianlan absolutely couldn't let anything happen to her. Although it was somewhat ironic, White Lotus was more like a memorial arch now. Immortal Tianlan could push down and destroy it whenever he wanted, but it was absolutely impossible for others to do it. Old Ma left first, and Lu Qin turned in the direction of the Kunlun Temple. At the same time he began to recall the appearance of that girl, White Lotus. To be honest, White Lotus was a very unique existence out of all the women he knew. She and Lu Qin had always been in a state where it was difficult to tell who was friend or foe. The relationship between the two of them was also very ambiguous. There were even a few times when they had fought and they had dealt fatal blows. Of course, Lu Qin didn't have any romantic feelings for this beautiful but unusually fierce girl. At least, he didn't think about it in that way at all. But for some reason, after discovering the abnormality of White Lotus, he almost immediately decided to investigate it without thinking. What was the reason? Could it be that the girl was beautiful after all? Would someone born with a beautiful and exquisite face have such a huge advantage over an ugly person? Lu Qin couldn't help laughing in his heart and put these boring thoughts aside. He thought that he should still be indifferent to White Lotus, at least now he was not nervous at all. In this way he walked to the front of the Kunlun Temple. After reporting, although it was late at night, the order of Immortal Tianlan quickly came out and asked him to go in. From this, it could be seen that Lu Qin indeed had a special position in Immortal Tianlan's heart. When Lu Qin walked to the Kunlun temple, he saw Immortal Tianlan sitting in the hall thoughtfully. Although it was late at night, it seemed that this bald immortal was still not sleepy at all. Without beating around the bush, Lu Qin directly walked over and sat beside him. Then he said, "White Lotus is missing. I can't find her." The expression on Immortal Tianlan's face didn't seem to change. He just raised his head and glanced at him. Lu Qin took a deep breath and said, "Did you want to kill her?" Chapter 589. Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at Lu Qin for a while before saying calmly, "I didn't give such an order and I didn't mean to do so recently." His words were a little strange and there seemed to be some repetition in their meaning. However, Lu Qin understood and nodded silently. Given Perfected Lord Tianlan's current power and status, he could naturally end someone's life with a single word. However, if it was inconvenient for him to kill someone, there were many ways to do it for him. As long as the people around him knew what he meant, countless people would do it for him. Perfected Lord Tianlan clearly said that he didn't want to kill White Lotus, at least not recently. This was very important and crucial. However, although Lu Qin was a little less worried because of this, he frowned again. If it wasn't done by Perfected Lord Tianlan, where could White Lotus have gone? Lu Qin lowered his head and pondered for a while. Then he felt Perfected Lord Tianlan's gaze on him. After a moment of hesitation, he calmly told him the entire process of him looking for White Lotus. In the end, he said softly, "I feel that this matter is a little strange, so I came to tell you." Perfected Lord Tianlan looked at him and suddenly smiled, as if he didn't care about White Lotus's fate at all. He merely sized up Lu Qin and said with a smile, "Are you suspecting me? Aren't you afraid that I'll get angry because of this?" Lu Qin shook his head. "I'm not suspecting you. I'm just here to confirm with you." He paused for a moment before continuing, "If you really had feelings for her, she would definitely die. At the same time, she wouldn't have left so many loose ends." Perfected Lord Tianlan laughed. "You're quite confident in me." Lu Qin said, "After all, you're the one who nurtured me. There's probably no one in the world who knows how powerful you are more than me." Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "Seems like you've improved your other skills while you weren't by my side all these years. You're really good at flattery. You're not embarrassed at all. You're better than me when I was young." Lu Qin lowered his head slightly and said, "You flatter me. When I was in the evil cult, I learned it myself in order to survive." Perfected Lord Tianlan's expression froze for a moment before returning to normal. After pondering for a moment, he said, "Wait a moment." In front of Lu Qin, True Lord Tianlan stood up and called his subordinate who was on duty outside the hall, ordering him to call Xueying from Fuyunji over. Lu Qin subconsciously glanced at the sky outside the main hall, only to see waves of blood surging in the night sky, dark red light blotting out the sky. Although it was late at night, it didn't seem much different from daytime. Of course, this was not a good time to meet and chat. If an ordinary person were to disturb a friend at this time, the other person would probably turn hostile and scold them for having a hole in their brain. However, when Perfected Lord Tianlan gave this order, his expression was indifferent, as if everything was natural. Perhaps in his eyes, this world, the entire world, should revolve around him. He had never cared about, or rather, considered the feelings and thoughts of most of the people around him. He only did what he wanted to do. However, the most terrifying thing was that after so many years, the achievements he had, the strength he possessed, his prestige, and his power had made all of this a matter of course. Lu Qin lowered his eyes slightly, his face expressionless. However, he was secretly thinking about how Xueying would feel if she, who was lying in a warm bed, was suddenly woken up and forced to rush here. Would she secretly scold this damned baldy for having a hole in his brain? Lu Qin was suddenly very curious about this. Nowadays, Zhengxianming was becoming more and more bloated, and the efficiency of many halls was deteriorating. They were dragging their feet, which was depressing. However, this did not include Fuyunji. For many years they had been fighting bloody battles with the devil cult, and under the strong management of True Lord Tianlan, who was different from ordinary people, the Fuyun Bureau still had a capable atmosphere. As the hall master of the most powerful hall in Zhengxianming, Xueying really set an example. Not long after Perfected Lord Tianlan's order was passed down, she had already rushed to the main hall of Kunlun in no more than a quarter of an hour. Someone had already instructed that if Xueying came, there was no need to inform her and that she could come in directly. Therefore Shuang hurried all the way looking a little anxious. It seemed that she was a little worried that there might be something urgent here with perfected Lord Tianlan. However, when she walked into the main hall of Kunlun and saw that Lu Chen was also sitting there, a strange expression appeared on her face. For a very long time in the past, she was often the only one who could accompany perfected Lord Tianlan to do things and preach in the middle of the night. Shuang took a deep breath, but a smile appeared on her face. It was as if she had suddenly completely forgotten the unpleasantness from a few days ago. She first nodded at Lu Chen in greeting, then faced perfected Lord Tianlan and bowed solemnly. She said softly, "Milord, are you looking for me?" Perfected Lord Tianlan nodded but did not say anything. He only pointed at Lu Chen. Seeing Shui Ying's somewhat surprised gaze turn towards him, Lu Chen had no choice but to tell her about White Lotus again. At the same time he was also secretly observing Shui Ying's expression. After all, Shui Ying's position on Celestial Dragon Mountain was special. She had been in a delicate situation recently, but she still had such a powerful force in her hands. If she really wanted to do something, even Lu Chen was not confident that he could completely stop this woman. Perhaps only perfected Lord Tianlan could completely suppress her. After hearing Lu Chen's words, Shuang was first surprised, then a thoughtful expression appeared on her face. At the same time, perfected Lord Tianlan slowly opened his mouth and called out to Shuang. "Shuang, your subordinate is here." Shuang bowed respectfully to perfected Lord Tianlan. Perfected Lord Tianlan said, "I asked you to secretly watch over White Lotus, right?" Lu Chen's heart skipped a beat. Shuang nodded and said, "Yes, I have already arranged for people to watch over her. When she did something unusual a few days ago we stopped her. However, ever since you agreed to let her go to the western continent's Kunlun Mountain, she seemed to be much more well-behaved when she returned to the Immortal City. Furthermore, you only told me not to let her leave the Immortal City casually. You did not forbid her from leaving the Immortal City on normal days, so I have probably slacked off a little. They will only appear near the borders of the Immortal City. At other times they are probably careless." Her expression was solemn as she said to perfected Lord Tianlan, "This matter is my dereliction of duty. Please give me a few days' time. I will make the arrangements now and definitely find out the whereabouts of White Lotus and report it to you." Perfected Lord Tianlan said indifferently, "We can talk about other things later. First, go and ask where White Lotus was last seen and who she has been in contact with recently. Investigate properly." Shuang nodded and said, "Yes." She then stood up and quickly left the hall. Sitting at the side, Lu Chen, who had not said a word throughout the entire process, frowned and said, "From what you said just now, could it be that you suspect someone?" Perfected Lord Tianlan harumphed and said coldly with a murderous expression, "In this immortal city, the only ones who dare to go against me and play tricks in the dark are those 4 to 5 old soul formation cultivators. It's good that this matter has come. I was planning to have a good chat with them anyway." Lu Chen looked at his expression and did not say anything. However, he only felt a slight chill around him. The night outside the hall seemed to be getting colder and colder. The wind was also getting stronger. Chapter 590. At daybreak, Lu Chen walked down from Sky Dragon Mountain and strolled on the streets of the Immortal City. The strange and gloomy sea of blood phenomenon in the sky had already seriously affected the most bustling and largest city in the world. In the past, at this time, the Immortal City would have already started to bustle with people coming and going in an endless stream. But today, when Lu Chen walked on the streets, he found that the surroundings seemed a little cold and desolate. There were only a few people coming out from the streets. Some people had left and some people stayed but were unwilling to go out. Even those who walked out of their houses looked heavy and depressed. After all, the terrifying sea of blood above their heads didn't look like a scene of doomsday no matter how they looked at it. How could anyone be happy about it? Lu Chen frowned slightly. He had thought of this scene before, but he did not expect it to be worse than what he had expected. Although the blood sea phenomenon was only a scenery floating in the sky and had never caused any substantial harm to the people in the Immortal City, the atmosphere was still unbearably oppressive. He did not even need to go to Fuyunji to know that the daily reports there must be more and more people leaving. At the far edge of the sky, about 20% of the sky was still bright. It was the original sky with a clear blue color and a few white clouds. There was also the sunlight from the sun that should have risen at this time, reflecting a faint golden light at the edge of the blood sea, telling people that this world was not originally like this. What would the future be like? No one knew. Lu Chen retracted his gaze and suddenly felt a little dispirited. He thought of White Lotus, whose whereabouts were unknown and whether she was alive or dead. He suddenly thought that perhaps leaving this city was also a good way to live. When he sensed this thought, he was also stunned. Although he had thought of escaping this place before, after Supreme Lord Tianlan came out and officially accepted him as a disciple, he announced to the world that he was going to hold a disciple acceptance ceremony and made it clear that this great foundation would be passed to him in the future. Lu Chen had long given up on this idea of escaping. His thoughts were all in this intense and violent power struggle to gain a firm foothold and fight for everything. He had never considered this bitter. Perhaps he was born a commoner. For the sake of power, for the sake of power, for the sake of strength, he could give up everything. He cursed that damned Baldy all day long, but perhaps in the depths of his heart, what he yearned for the most was to become that kind of person. But on this day, for some unknown reason, his will seemed to be slightly shaken. Perhaps, it was just an inexplicable melancholy on the morning of a new day. Lu Chen laughed bitterly in his heart. Just as he was about to leave, he suddenly saw a somewhat familiar figure walking over from the street in front of him. The other party also seemed to see him, and a trace of surprise appeared on his face as he stopped in his tracks. It was Song Wenji. On the street in the early morning, under the oppressive and gloomy sky, they met by chance on this cold and desolate street. Morning? Lu Chen was the first to speak. He nodded at Song Wenji politely but not politely, greeting her. Song Wenji also revealed a trace of a smile. In this oppressive and gloomy street, her appearance was still beautiful. Moreover, perhaps it was Lu Chen's misconception. Under her familiar charm on this morning, Song Wenji's clear and bright eyes faintly carried a trace of strange innocence. Like a playful child, longing for the beautiful scenery outside the house, secretly running out of the house early in the morning, breathing in the fresh air, running to her heart's content on the small path between the mountains. Her skirt fluttered, the cool breeze swept past her smiling face and hair, leaving behind a clear and melodious laughter like a wind chime. That was an innocent child, that was a beautiful time. Elegant like a bubble, bursting in an instant. She stood under this terrifying dark red sky, still that enchanting seductress. She buried her innocence, changed her smile, walked over and said with a smile, "Were you busy last night? Why are you here so early in the morning? Did you just come down from the mountain?" "Yes." Lu Chen said smoothly, "Last night my teacher came to talk to me about something but it was delayed, so I just came down from the mountain. What about you?" Song Wenji seemed to say it casually, "I also. Oh, I went to bed early last night. When I woke up in the morning I was moved and wanted to go out for a walk." She changed her words. Lu Chen noticed this. After glancing at Song Wenji, he thought that maybe she felt that it was not nice to say that. Lu Chen could stay with perfected Lord Tianlan for a whole night to discuss things, but if she told others that she stayed with perfected Lord Jianghu for a whole night, no matter what she said or did, there would probably be countless rumors immediately. Even though the rumors had already spread like wildfire, it was still a rumor. But no matter what, it seemed that this woman still wanted to maintain her mood and dignity this morning. Lu Chen smiled and nodded, saying to Song Wenji, "You are the most comfortable. I have been busy all night and haven't eaten anything yet. How about this, have you eaten? I'll treat you to breakfast." "Breakfast?" Song Wenji looked at Lu Chen with some surprise. For successful cultivators like them, the normal need for food had actually been reduced to a negligible level. Most of the time, they only had a taste for ordinary people's food. However, perhaps it was because Lu Chen's smile looked gentle, or because in the past few years after the rumors about her and perfected Lord Jianghu spread, no other man dared to invite her out like this. Was it because he was the disciple of perfected Lord Tianlan? Her heart jumped a few times, then she suddenly revealed a smile. That little bit of pure joy was mixed with the beauty that could charm all living beings. She nodded heavily and said, "Okay." The Immortal City was a huge city with countless people. Although there were many cultivators, there were even more ordinary mortals living here. Because of Zheng Xianmeng's strong maintenance of order, cultivators and mortals were like two completely different classes, living peacefully in this city. To eat breakfast, of course, they had to go to a place where mortals lived. Lu Chen led Song Wenji through a few streets, came to a street where mortals lived, and turned into a very lively alley. Then in front of them was an extraordinarily lively stall. Along the alley, there were at least a few hundred people, either standing or sitting, eating breakfast here, talking and laughing, as if the smoke of the mortal world was blowing in their faces. Let's do it here, what do you think? Lu Chen smiled and turned back, saying to Song Wenji. However, the moment he turned back and saw Song Wenji, he was suddenly startled. He saw Song Wenji standing beside him, staring blankly at the alley in front of her. Her eyes were deep, as if she saw something that stirred up her emotions. She actually stood there motionless, as if she did not hear Lu Chen's words at all. Many years of time at that moment seemed to flow backward, gently flashing past her eyes. She had a happy and beautiful childhood. Holding that soft and warm hand, she ran here, pointed at the stall, and shouted with a smile, "Sister, let's eat there." "Miss Song?" Lu Chen's voice rang in her ears, awakening Song Wenji from her memories. Her body trembled slightly, and then she slightly lowered her head. After a moment, when she raised her head again, she revealed a smile and said to Lu Chen softly, "Come, I know a very delicious stall here, I'll take you there." Chapter 591. A small wooden table and a shabby chair were placed casually on the roadside of the alley. A canvas was propped above their heads. Usually it was used to shield them from the sun and rain. But now it also blocked the dark red glow above their heads, making people feel at ease for no reason. A bowl of wonton, a little sesame oil, sprinkled with fresh green onions, was steaming hot and fragrant. It was somewhat appetizing, making people salivate and have an appetite. A big bowl was placed at the corner of the table with chopsticks and spoons inside. Song Wenji happily took the white porcelain spoon, squinting her eyes to smell the fragrance. She took a deep breath, revealing a somewhat satisfied expression on her face. Lu Chen looked at her from the side, and then looked at the same bowl of wonton in front of him. After a moment of hesitation, he also picked up the spoon and scooped a mouthful of soup, tasting the taste. Song Wenji was not in a hurry to eat, revealing a somewhat expectant expression. She looked at Lu Chen and said with a smile, "How is it delicious?" Saying this, she sighed again and said, "This is an old stall for many years. I ate here when I was a child. The taste is too delicious." Lu Chen looked at the bowl of wonton in front of him, a glimmer of light flashed in the depths of his eyes, and then he raised his eyes to look at Song Wenji. This woman, in Jianghu Hall and even in Zhengxianming, with her identity as the adopted daughter of immortal Jianghu, could be said to be in the limelight of the younger generation. Even if she could not completely do as she pleased, but most of the time she should be free to do whatever she wanted. She had been in Jianghu Hall for a few years, but in these few years, listening to the meaning of her words, it seemed that she had never returned here to eat the food that she had always been thinking about. Was it because she had been too busy these years and had no time to come over, or was there another reason? And these words, which vaguely revealed some secrets, were heard by ordinary people, but for Lu Chen, it was very easy for him to detect the subtle inappropriateness of it. Logically speaking, Song Wenji should have known about Lu Chen's identity and the suspicious points in her words, but she still said it. What did that mean? Lu Chen was silent for a moment, but he didn't answer Song Wenji's question. Instead, he smiled at her and said, "Looks like you're in a good mood today. Did anything good happen recently?" "How could there be anything good? There should be a lot of bad things." Song Wenji sighed and scooped some soup with a spoon, but she didn't drink it. It seemed that she was afraid of the heat. She swirled the soup in the bowl twice and said, "Do you know what happened in the rain-listening building on the mountain a few days ago?" "Yes, I went there that night too. I watched from outside the building," Lu Chen said. Song Wenji glanced at him. For some reason she seemed a little embarrassed. Her cheeks blushed slightly. At that moment she was as tender and beautiful as a peach. She was a little shy and a little melancholy. She sighed and said, "I lost face. Did you see it that night? I was very embarrassed, wasn't I?" Lu Chen said seriously, "A little embarrassed, but when it comes to losing face it's definitely not like that. That matter has nothing to do with you. It's all that perverted thief's evil deeds. He deserves to die 1,000 times, but you are innocent and implicated." Song Wenji's eyes flickered like sparkling gems. She didn't look like a little girl who was sad and tearful. She always looked beautiful and charming with a bit of heroic spirit and strength. It was rare to see her weak side. She looked thoughtful and said, "What you said makes sense. Unfortunately, the world is like this. When a woman is humiliated, even if she doesn't lose her chastity, there will be endless rumors." She looked at Lu Chen and asked, "In the past few days, have you heard those rumors about me?" Lu Chen was silent. He didn't know what to say for a moment. To be honest, he had indeed heard those rumors. In this cultivation world where men were respected, A beautiful woman with her clothes torn and tattered at night would naturally cause people's imaginations to run wild and imagine many things and scenes. When it came to these matters, Lu Qin sometimes felt that there was no difference between cultivators and mortals. He didn't say anything, but Song Wenji naturally knew the answer. She shrugged and didn't look particularly angry. She only smiled and said, "But it seems like you don't believe it." "That's not bad. People like you are very rare. I thank you." Lu Qin waved his hand and said, "If I really believed those nonsense, then I would be stupid." Song Wenji's bright eyes stared at him. The expression on her face seemed to be somewhat complicated. After a while, she suddenly opened her mouth and asked Lu Qin, "I heard that a long time ago, you were a shadow in Fiyunji?" Lu Qin's heart trembled slightly, but his expression didn't change. He nodded and said, "That's true." Song Wenji seemed to sigh and said, "To be able to go from a shadow that no one knows about to becoming the disciple of a true monarch in the Floating Clouds Bureau, your experiences can really be said to be legendary." "I just had a bit of luck," Lu Qin said lightly. Then he looked at her and said with a smile, "Everything was fine. Why are you suddenly interested in my past?" Song Wenji didn't say anything. On this depressing and gloomy morning, in this bustling mortal street, they sat on a shabby table and chair in the middle of the crowd, like an ordinary husband and wife in the mortal world. They looked at each other with calm expressions. The people around them didn't seem to notice anything, using the smoke and fire to cover the faint fierceness in their eyes. What does it feel like to be a shadow? Song Wenji's white, jade-like fingers held the white porcelain spoon and spun it in the bowl of wonton in front of her. As the porcelain spoon gently touched the wall of the bowl, it made a crisp sound. The soup was no longer as hot as before, and there were wisps of white smoke curling up, making her face look a little blurry. Lu Qin thought to himself that she didn't seem to have eaten a single wonton until now. After a moment of silence, Lu Qin said, "Probably because I couldn't eat well or sleep well. I was afraid every day and my heart was always on edge. I always felt that maybe in the next moment I would be stabbed to death or surrounded and captured by a group of people, and then tortured to death." Song Wenji's fingers paused for a moment. In the light white smoke, she raised her head and looked at Lu Qin. After a while, she said softly, "That didn't feel good, right? It didn't feel good, so I chose to stab someone to death with a knife." Lu Qin said with a slightly self-deprecating tone, and then he stretched out his palm and said with a self-deprecating smile, "Look, it's stained with blood." Suddenly, Song Wenji's hand came through the white smoke and held Lu Qin's hand. Lu Qin's expression froze and he almost subconsciously shrank back. He didn't look at Song Wenji but looked around himself. A fierce intent spread out around him in an instant, and then dissipated. "I didn't ask someone to ambush you here," Song Wenji said. "After all, you are the most beloved and only disciple of Supreme Tianlan. If something happens to you, no one can bear the wrath of that person, not even me. At that time, I'm afraid even my foster father can't protect me." Lu Qin smiled and said, "It seems that I still have a good backer." Song Wenji's eyes were slightly blurred. She looked at the palm in her hand. This man's skin was not delicate, and she felt rough and solid when she touched it. It was as if he was used to holding weapons, but for some reason, it didn't smell blood as she had imagined. "It's not easy to be a shadow," she said faintly. Lu Qin looked at her and didn't say anything. Then, as expected, she continued with some emotion and some contempt, saying, "Unfortunately, some people are still racking their brains to do it." Lu Qin looked at her without blinking. The smile on his face slowly disappeared, and there was some coldness in his expression. Song Wenji didn't seem to care and let go of her hand. But Lu Qin suddenly turned over his palm and suddenly grabbed her slender, white and soft palm. Song Wenji looked up at him, her eyes were as clear as water. Lu Qin looked at her for a while, and the frost on his face gradually receded. After a while, he let go of her hand and said gently, "Quickly eat breakfast or it'll be cold." Song Wenji looked down at the bowl of wonton, and used her fingers to scoop up a spoonful of soup. But she shook her head and with an indifferent expression she stood up and said, "It's not good anymore. The taste of when I was young is gone." As she spoke, she threw down the spoon and turned to walk away. Not long after, she left the warm and bustling alley, but in the eyes of cultivators, seemed to be a bit lowly and ordinary. She walked away without looking back. Chapter 592. Old Ma, who had a good night's sleep last night, was in good spirits today, and even his mood was better. Although his situation was not particularly good during this period of time, there were still some annoying things. For example, the way to leave the Immortal City, which was a troublesome place, was inexplicably taken away by Chen He. But now that he thought about it, things were actually not too bad. Although the sea of blood in the sky above looked very scary, the legendary or imagined doomsday had not yet appeared. No one knew what the future would be like. Maybe it would be fine? And Chen He, who was proud of his success a few days ago, had his family destroyed overnight. This also made old Ma secretly feel a little lucky. Perhaps this matter was not necessarily related to leaving the Immortal City, but who could say for sure whether it was a blessing or a misfortune? It was better to be content with what he had and do what he had to do now. Besides, Lu Chen's position in Supreme Tianlan's faction was obviously rising day by day. It seemed that his future was not too bad. With this self-comfort, old Ma felt that life had suddenly become better, and his mood was also cheerful. Many years ago, when he and Lu Chen were still living in seclusion in the remote mountain village of Qingshitang village, he was already very familiar with this set of spiritual victory method. Thus, when he walked briskly up Celestial Dragon Mountain and found Lu Chen outside the main hall of the Floating Clouds department, Lu Chen stared at his cheerful and spirited appearance for a long time. Then he asked suspiciously, "Why are you so happy? Could it be that you have encountered some great news?" Old Ma chuckled and said, "What are you talking about? I'm in a good mood today, so can't I be happy?" Lu Chen raised his head to look at the gloomy and oppressive sky, and then turned to look at the austere and solemn Floating Clouds Bureau, as well as those people who always had solemn and grave expressions on their faces. He then said to old Ma honestly, "Everyone on this mountain has a bitter expression on their faces. As long as you are the only one who is relaxed and happy, then everyone will find you an eyesore." Old Ma was taken aback. He quickly looked around and found that it was just as Lu Chen had said. After a moment of shock, he hurriedly pulled him aside and asked in a low voice, "Did something happen again?" "Actually, it's nothing big," Lu Chen said. "It's just that the damn Baldy was in a bad mood today. He ran out and quarreled with someone, which caused quite a commotion. He just came back." Old Ma's eyes widened. After a moment he gasped. What was Perfected Lord Tianlan's status? Even among Zheng Xianmeng, who was almost invincible in the world of cultivation, he was now the number one in name and in reality. The number one person in Zheng Xianmeng was, of course, the number one person in the entire cultivation world. Such a big shot went out to quarrel with someone today? And it caused quite a commotion? Old Ma was not stupid. Although Lu Chen's words did not make it clear, he could figure out that there were only a few people on Mount Tianlong who were qualified to quarrel with Perfected Lord Tianlan. As for other people, even if they were Yuanying Jinren, in front of an angry Perfected Lord of Huashan Realm, they were more likely to be sent flying with a slap, rather than quarreling with words without violence. Old Ma's original joy suddenly dissipated, but he was not too depressed. After all, it seemed that a fight between immortals would not involve a small figure like him. Instead, he was a little more curious. He pulled Lu Chen and asked, "Which Perfected Lord is it?" He paused, thought for a moment and said, "I guess it's most likely Perfected Lord Tiehu." Perfected Lord Tiehu was old-fashioned and upright. In Zheng Xianmeng, Perfected Lord Tianlan was not very pleasing to the eye. Everyone knew that there were conflicts between Tianhun Hall and Fiyunji from time to time. Therefore, Old Ma's first reaction was that these two old enemies were quarreling again for some reason, but he did not expect the reaction to be so big this time. Unexpectedly, Lu Chen shook his head and said, "It's not Perfected Lord Tiehu." Old Ma was stunned and said in surprise, "What? It's not that person? It shouldn't be. Could it be Perfected Lord Guanghua from Dezayuan? Is he jealous of Fiyunji's recent profits? It's unlikely for the others. Perfected Lord Golden Dragon? It seems." Lu Chen interrupted him and said, "Stop guessing. It's Perfected Lord Guyu from Starry Hall." Perfected Lord Guyu? Old Ma was really shocked this time. There was even a look of disbelief on his face. He said, "It shouldn't be. Isn't Starry Hall on good terms with us recently? Not to mention the other things, Starry Hall handled and guarded the devil cult's catacombs at the foot of the mountain together with us. Why are the two of them quarreling?" Lu Chen shrugged and said, "Who knows? I heard that Perfected Lord Guyu punished a few of his trusted disciples. One of them was accused of being too close to Fiyunji. When the news came out, the damn Baldy flew into a rage. He ran to Perfected Lord Guyu and quarreled. He even said that your Starry Hall is not clean either. You're always stuffing nails and shadows into Fiyunji. Don't think that we don't know." Old Ma was speechless for a moment. Although what Lu Chen said sounded unbelievable, he really didn't dare to deny it. Because he knew in his heart that these words were very likely to be true. However, there seemed to be something strange about this matter. Do you feel that there's something wrong with this matter? Lu Chen pulled old Ma and walked around the Floating Clouds Department's main hall towards the Kunlun Palace at the back. At the same time he asked old Ma in a low voice. Old Ma nodded very honestly. After a moment of silence he said hesitantly, logically speaking, the two of them are of such high status. How could they, they shouldn't quarrel so easily. Lu Chen said faintly, because I just talked to the damn Baldy last night. He said that our Fiyunji may have been stuffed with many spies. Maybe there are people who betrayed us and took the initiative to collude with those outsiders. So, the damn Baldy seemed to be very angry early in the morning. When he heard the news from Starry Hall, he angrily went over and quarreled with them. Old Ma was a little stunned and said, "That's it?" Lu Chen nodded and said, "That's it." But then he smiled and said thoughtfully, "But I always feel that he seemed to be doing it for someone to see. What do you think?" Old Ma was silent. These words, including some deeper speculations, could be said by Lu Chen at will, but he had some taboos. He looked at Lu Chen from the corner of his eyes. He saw that Lu Chen's face was solemn. He seemed to be thinking about something, but his eyes gradually brightened. Probably he is finally going to start. Chapter 593. Everyone on Sky Dragon Mountain knew that the relationship between the 6 perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm was a little subtle. The reason for this was very simple and easy to understand. They were all figures who stood at the peak of the cultivation world of the human race, and all other mountains were insignificant. Those who could ascend to this position were all peerless talents. Not to mention aptitude in this regard, rare talent was only the most basic thing. It could even be said that at this level, precious qualities such as hard work, indomitable spirit, and unyielding perseverance were nothing. Instead, luck and opportunity became the key to the final separation between gods and mortals. Humans were not born to be fair. You have your opportunities and I have my fate. In short, those who could become deity transformation stage perfected monarchs could almost be seen as divine rights bestowed by the heavens. They were favored by the heavens, so they were naturally proud and arrogant people. They were all great geniuses, all big shots with their eyes on the top of their heads, and all of them thought that they were the best in the world. Therefore, when they saw that there were actually people around them who were similar to them, they would naturally be a little displeased. Regarding this, even the most low-key and peaceful perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm would probably have such thoughts. Therefore, although these perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm in Zhengxianming were highly respected and powerful, they had always kept a certain distance from each other. And the occasional frictions and quarrels between them were like gossip that the people of Sky Dragon Mountain never got tired of, and had always been the topic of people's leisure time for many years. It seemed that this quarrel between the 2 perfected cultivators of the divine transformation realm, Tianlan and Guyu, seemed to be one of these immortal fights that no one was surprised to see. Although perfected cultivator Tianlan seemed to have gone a little too far by going from his own territory to the Star Hall and quarreling with perfected cultivator Guyu, although no one really heard of it, and no one really felt that there were signs of a big fight or Tao or divine powers inside, the scene was still quite frightening. Perhaps, it was because perfected Lord Tianlan was so powerful that he was bursting with ambition and could no longer tolerate being treated as an equal to others. In fact, he could no longer suppress his ambition and was about to take action? This conjecture immediately spread like wildfire after the quarrel between the 2 bigwigs. In a short time, it spread throughout the entire Sky Dragon Mountain. In the blink of an eye, it even overshadowed the drama of immortal Jianghu punishing the perverted thief in the rain-listening tower for the sake of his adopted daughter a few days ago, and became the focus of everyone's attention. In addition to the fact that both sides of the quarrel were frightening big shots like perfected gods of Huashan realm, there was another point that had secretly attracted many people's attention. According to the original view, perfected Lord Tianlan's Fiyunji was now well-deserved to be the #1 force in Zhengxianming, and the force closest to them seemed to be Starry Hall. But now, it seemed that perfected Lord Tianlan, who had always been arrogant and condescending, and was arrogant even among perfected lords of the divine transformation realm, had finally lost his rationality and could no longer tolerate anyone's disrespect towards him. So, he went to Starry Hall and scolded perfected Lord Guyu. It was said that perfected Lord Guyu was so angry that his face turned pale at that time, and had a big quarrel with the famous bald perfected Lord Tianlan. During the quarrel, he even disregarded his identity several times and sarcastically ridiculed perfected Lord Tianlan's shortcoming of not being able to grow hair on his head, further infuriating perfected Lord Tianlan. Of course, big shots at this level basically used their mouths and not their fists. Once they started fighting, it would basically cause a landslide. Wise people would not take it and people would not like it. After the incident, everyone in Starry Hall was half dead with anger. After all, everyone was a famous force in the world, and they really could not bear the humiliation when someone came to their door and slapped them in the face. But if that person was called Tianlan, forget it, they had to bear it even if they could not bear it. However, since then, the relationship between Starry Hall and Fuyunji instantly became like fire and water. Both sides were at daggers drawn, and there were many incidents of people quarreling and even fighting each other. It was a joyous occasion. Lu Qin was summoned by someone sent by perfected Lord Tianlan. When he walked to the entrance of Kunlun Hall, he happened to see Shuang also there. At the entrance of the hall, the two of them happened to meet. Lu Qin glanced at this woman and found that she seemed to be a little tired. He did not know if it was because she had been too busy recently and was under too much pressure. Thinking about it, it must have been hard on her. Originally, a large hall like Fuyunji already had a lot of affairs to deal with, but the big shot at the top did not stop worrying. He just had to find trouble and quarrel with the perfected Lord of Soul Formation of Starry Hall, causing an uproar in the city. It was enough to give her a headache. Thinking of this, Lu Qin smiled slightly, but took half a step back and made a gesture of letting Shuang go first. Shuang was obviously startled and could not help but take another look at Lu Qin. Ever since the power struggle outside Chen He's house, the relationship between the two had deteriorated rapidly. Unexpectedly, Lu Qin seemed to take a step back today. But no matter what, this was also a kind gesture. Shuang was not the kind of woman who put everything on the surface. Although she had some doubts in her heart, she still put on a gentle expression and nodded at Lu Qin. After pondering for a while, she still walked through the door first. After all, there were many eyes and ears watching in the surroundings. Perhaps this situation could let them understand something. There were no outsiders in the hall. Only perfected Lord Tianlan sat there and seemed to be cursing. When he saw them enter one after another, his gaze swept across them. His expression did not change much and he beckoned them over. Seeing that this person seemed to be a little angry and anxious, Lu Qin frowned. He felt that this damn Baldy was a little unusual. At least in his memory he had almost never seen him not calm like this. When Shuang and Lu Qin approached, perfected Lord Tianlan did not let them sit down and talk. He asked directly, "I heard that there were people who had a dispute with Starry Hall and even fought?" Shuang nodded and said, "Yes, there were 17 disputes between the two sects in the past few days. I have already dealt with 5 of the fights and detained the people who fought." Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted and said, "Have you found out that it was them who started it first?" Shuang hesitated for a moment and a trace of awkwardness flashed across her face. She said, "It was just a verbal argument. Most of the time it was Starry Hall who started it. However, for the 5 fights, it was us who started it first." Lu Qin rolled his eyes in his heart. He thought to himself, the Floating Clouds Company's reputation for being domineering these days was indeed well deserved. It was clearly his boss who had acted rudely scolding others in their territory. In the end he was still arrogantly bullying others. Perfected Lord Tianlan snorted again and said, "Who won and who lost the fights?" Shuang said, "Most of the time it was our people who won." After a pause, she lowered her voice a little, but the two people around her could still hear her clearly. She said, Most of the time we have more people. More people bullying less people. This is no different from a street gangster," Lu Qin thought. At this moment, perfected Lord Tianlan said angrily, "Well done, release the people you detained. That old fart Gu you dared to call me Baldy. This time I must teach him a lesson." Chapter 594. True Lord Tianlan's embarrassment turned into anger after being scolded bald, and then he flew into a rage and even vented his anger. This kind of behavior was very strange and incongruous when it happened to True Lord Tianlan. However, it was common knowledge that every big shot who had reached the level of divine transformation True Lord actually had the right to do as they pleased. Most of the time, they were aloof and seemed to be above the common people, but as long as they were willing, they could also put down their pride and haggle without any scruples. If the same thing happened to an ordinary person, it would be vulgar and shallow, but if true Lord Tianlan did it, Lord True Lord is indeed a man of character. You love and care for your subordinates and you are also wise and mighty. It is our great fortune to be able to serve you. Shueying revealed an excited expression and sincerely expressed her loyalty. At the side, Lu Chen couldn't help but stare at Shueying a few more times. The expression of surprise on his face clearly said, I didn't think that a powerful and arrogant hall master like you would actually know how to flatter. Although Shueying's expression remained the same under Lu Chen's gaze, there was still a trace of unnaturalness in her eyes, as if she was a little embarrassed, but she quickly concealed it. True Lord Tianlan seemed to be very satisfied with Shueying's attitude. He nodded and said to her, I trust you when you do things. Let's do as we said earlier and secretly make those people from Starry Hall suffer a little. But don't make things too big. Although I'm not afraid of trouble, I also want to avoid breaking that old man Guyu's tail and making him jump up and bite people. What he meant was that he was directly comparing that person from Starry Hall to a dog. In this world, there was probably only one person who could be so unscrupulous towards a divine transformation true lord. Shueying and Lu Chen didn't dare to say anything. Shueying agreed and quickly retreated. Lu Chen watched her figure disappear through the door, then looked back at True Lord Tianlan and frowned. She was just flattering you. True Lord Tianlan's expression had already relaxed. Hearing this, he casually spread his hands and said, Yes, but that was her own action. I couldn't do anything about it. Couldn't do anything about it? There was an old saying, when the superior likes something, the inferior will follow it. Lu Chen shook his head and opened his mouth to say something, but in the end he closed it. True Monarch Tianlan did not notice Lu Chen's expression and said to him, Let Shueying handle the matters of scheming with the other mountains in the Immortal Alliance. She is familiar with everything and has experience, so there is no need to worry. I called you here because I have something else to tell you. Shueying asked. Shueying said. The people below have been investigating for a few days. Although they have not found White Lotus's whereabouts, on the last day, there were people who saw her figure in 3 different places. After saying that, he looked at Lu Chen meaningfully and told Lu Chen 3 locations in chronological order. These 3 places were not on Mount Celestial Dragon but on the streets of the Immortal City. Lu Chen's brows slowly furrowed. He counted the days in his heart and recalled the few hours that Supreme Lord Tianlan had mentioned. Suddenly, his expression changed abruptly. There was shock in his eyes as he raised his head to look at Supreme Lord Tianlan. True Lord Tianlan smiled and said, Looks like you've thought of it? Lu Chen took a deep breath and said slowly, Those 3 hours on that day, I happened to pass by those 3 places. After a pause, Lu Chen narrowed his eyes and said, So she was secretly following me that day. Mo. A low cry came from the entrance of the main hall of Kunlun. Lu Chen looked in that direction and saw Oxen's huge body walking past the entrance of the main hall, followed by a black figure. It seemed to be Atsu. These days Atsu would often come to play with Oxen. However, since Oxen was suddenly suppressed in the underground cave and suffered a great loss, Atsu's attitude towards Oxen seemed to have a subtle change. They no longer respected Oxen as they used to. They seemed to have realized that Oxen also had a weakness. But no matter what, Oxen was still powerful, so Atsu seemed to be willing to play the role of a follower until now. Lu Chen recalled that he seemed to have been brought into that underground cave by the Green Ox that day. His heart skipped a beat and he turned to look at Perfected Lord Tianlan again. Before he could speak, Perfected Lord Tianlan had already said, Go. It seems that you have a clue. I don't care what you're going to do. In short, I want to see her if she's alive and I want to see her corpse if she's dead. Lu Chen was silent. Then he nodded and turned to walk out. When he walked out of the door, he paused and then barked at Atsu, who was not far away. Atsu took a look at Oxen and quickly ran to him, wagging its tail at him, looking very friendly. Lu Chen said, Accompany me to do something. Atsu barked. It looked like he agreed. Lu Chen glanced at Oxen, who was lying lazily on the side, and strode over. Seeing that the 2 most capable and powerful people under him had left, True Lord Tianlan sat on the spot for a while and slowly let out a long sigh. A hint of fatigue actually appeared on his face. As if affected by his sigh, a golden light suddenly lit up on his chest. A moment later, the Kunlun seal actually flew out of his clothes and floated in the air. True Lord Tianlan took a look at the Kunlun seal and frowned, but didn't say anything. He casually waved his sleeve in the direction of the door, and an invisible gust of wind blew past. Immediately, there was a series of snapping sounds, and the many doors and windows in the Kunlun Hall were all closed. You have to be careful too. There are eyes and ears everywhere on this mountain. What if someone sees something strange and becomes suspicious? Black Dragon's thunderous voice rang out in the golden light. There seemed to be a hint of mockery in it. Didn't you say that this is the safest and most reliable place in the world? Why are you afraid of that? True Lord Tianlan smiled bitterly and said somewhat helplessly, who can really be absolutely safe? Enough of this nonsense. Black Dragon's voice sounded a little impatient. Let me ask you. This time, when the blood moon is at its peak, we will completely destroy the underground demon clan. This matter is simple and clear to begin with. Why are you stirring up trouble again and again here, giving rise to new problems and tormenting yourself endlessly? If something important is delayed, remember that I won't let you off. Faced with the Black Dragon's sudden threat, True Lord Tianlan's expression didn't change. With a composed expression, he said indifferently, "Don't worry, I will naturally do what I have to do. However, I think you don't mind taking advantage of this rare opportunity to do some trivial things while I'm at it?" The golden light flickered and the Black Dragon's panting could be heard from the depths of the light. At the very least, it sounded a little angry. However, for some reason, such a huge divine beast seemed to be somewhat fearful of True Lord Tianlan. After a while, the Black Dragon sneered and said, "You just have to control yourself. Otherwise, if you mess up something important, don't worry about me turning against you when the time comes." With that, the Black Dragon's voice disappeared. The golden light in the air faded and the Kunlun seal flew back to True Lord Tianlan's hand in a swaying manner. Perfected Lord Tianlan gripped the golden seal gently with a cold expression. Chapter 595. The street leading to the underground city in the White Tiger district of the Immortal City was still tightly guarded. The curtains were still erected to block the curious gazes of ordinary people. However, what was different from before was that only Fiyunji's faction and Starry Hall's Fiyunji's faction were left. As for the reason, it was very simple. After the big fight between True Lord Tianlan and True Lord Guyu of Starry Hall, even if the two factions usually got along well, they were probably not on good terms anymore. Not only could they not get along with each other peacefully, they had to glare at each other, gnash their teeth, curse each other, and yell at each other. Then, the people of the Starry Hall would flick their sleeves and leave in disdain, and the people of the Floating Clouds Agency would take over the situation triumphantly. Everyone was happy and they all felt that they had won. Not only did they gain face for their boss, but they also stood their ground and avoided hurting themselves. It could be seen that those who could survive in the true Immortal Alliance were all sly and cunning. After Lu Qin came down from the mountain and brought Atsu here, he saw this very peaceful and joyous scene. Someone had already come up to greet him with a smile. One had to know that this young man's status was not ordinary now. In the future, he might even be able to sit in the position of True Lord Tianlan. Although there was still Hall Master Shuiying of Fiyunji standing there, and it was said that she was not on good terms with her, no one was stupid. Hall Master Shuiying of course had True Lord Tianlan's trust and power, but after so many years, why didn't he take Shuiying in as his disciple? It was said that strength was respected in the cultivation world. However, the invisible and intangible status was still everywhere in reality. Lu Qin very politely greeted the leader of the guards called Lu Ting, and then said to him, "Lord Tianlan sent me over to do something." Lu Ting nodded without hesitation and said, "Of course. Is it enough for you alone? Do you want me to send another team to follow you? Whether it's to run errands or to help with some chores, it's fine." Lu Qin pondered for a moment and said, "I don't think so. But thank you for your good intentions, Chief Lu." Lu Ting laughed heartily, his eyes narrowing as he smiled. He said in an extremely amiable manner, "Young master is too polite. In short, everything will be as you wish. In any case, we are all here. If you need anything, just tell us and we will be there immediately." Lu Qin smiled and nodded. He couldn't help but take another look at Lu Ting. After a moment, he took 2 steps to the side. As expected, Lu Ting followed. Lu Qin smiled and said, "Chief Lu, thank you very much. But I remember that the brothers and colleagues stationed here should be the elites of Fiyunji." If you are so close to me in public, isn't it a little inappropriate? Be careful not to be bullied later." After saying this, Lu Qin paid attention to Lu Ting's expression. Sure enough, Lu Ting's expression stiffened for a moment, but then returned to normal. Then, with a sincere expression, he said, "Young master is thinking too much. But this subordinate will remember this intention. This subordinate belongs to Fiyunji and has been risking life and death here for many years. Although I am slow-witted, I still understand one thing. All the brothers here, including all of Fiyunji, will not belong to anyone other than Lord Tianlanlan. Even if there is such a person, it can only be the one that Lord Tianlan has recognized and recognized. At this point, it was basically impossible to go any further. The occasion and atmosphere were not suitable, but Lu Ting's meaning was very clear. Lu Chen's brows drooped, but he felt a little emotional. Although it had been a few days since he quarreled with Xueying, and it had been even longer since he officially became Lord Tianlan's personal disciple, other than old Ma who was originally with him, there was also Qin He who he had instigated to defect to him, but then defected to Xueying's side. During this period of time, no subordinates of Lord Tianlan had come to his side. This Lu Ting, regardless of his position, character, or even strength, was the first person who had intentionally switched sides from the original Fiyunji system. Could this be the beginning? Who would have thought that they would encounter such a thing by accident on this trip? Although the real effect might not be very great, and even Lu Ting's sincerity in defecting still needed to be tested, but in the end, cracks were beginning to appear in the solid Fiyunji system. Lu Chen was still very happy. He smiled and nodded to Lu Ting, whispered a few words to him, and then led Atsu into the underground world through the tunnel entrance. Behind him, Lu Ting respectfully escorted them all the way to the tunnel entrance. Only after Lu Chen's figure had disappeared did he straighten up. At this moment, one of his trusted aides came over and said in a low voice, "There's no one around, our subordinates are all watching." Lu Ting nodded and replied, That trusted aide hesitated for a moment and said, "Brother Lu, will there be trouble if you do this?" Lu Ting snorted and said, "What trouble? I didn't do anything. Young Master Lu Chen is Lord Perfected's disciple. There's nothing wrong with me serving him respectfully. You can't expect a small character like me to treat him coldly, right?" After a pause he said again, "Pass down the order, no one is allowed to know about what happened today. Even if someone asks, they can only say that I'm a coward and don't dare to slight young Master Lu." Got it? That trusted aide showed a look of understanding and also smiled. While the two of them were talking, among the ordinary guards in the distance, an ordinary-looking guard who was standing next to a cloth curtain in the periphery glanced over coldly at them. Lu Chen's memory was very good. He would remember many things from a long time ago clearly, no matter if these memories were pleasant or painful, including those days and nights spent in the devil sect. Therefore, even now, when he was arguing with others, he would suddenly think of the woman who was killed by the evil cult. After a while, he would remember the woman's name and other things. This was somewhat like a talent. Those things seemed to be engraved in his mind. Most of the time it was just a deep sleep. Lu Chen had long gotten used to this habit of his, even if most of the time this kind of memory brought him more pain. But on this day when he once again stepped into the underground city shrouded by the blood moon, when the blood-red light once again fell on his body, Lu Chen suddenly felt the power of the black fire in his body suddenly tremble, as if it was about to boil. Perhaps in the real world outside, the sea of blood in the sky was gradually approaching its climax. Or perhaps for some reason, the strange aura of the underground world was becoming stronger and stranger. At that moment, when Lu Chen was subconsciously suppressing the power of the black fire in his body, he suddenly felt as if there was a roar in his mind. His body trembled, and then there seemed to be a strange bolt of lightning suddenly piercing through the dark sky in his mind, illuminating some of the deep shadows. Suddenly, a drop of sweat quietly slid down his forehead. He stopped in his tracks and was in a daze. At that moment he discovered that in the memory that he thought was complete, there seemed to be an additional blank space. At the last moment of the Battle of the Desolate Valley, when he woke up again, he had completely lost his memory of that period of time. You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.